There's a strange and powerful silence that hangs over the ruins of a once great city. It's more than just an absence of sound. It's a presence, a whisper carried on the wind through crumbling arches and down empty streets paved by forgotten hands. If you stand very still in such a place, you can almost feel the echoes of the lives that were lived here, the bustling markets, the grand processions, the countless daily routines of a civilization that believed it would last forever. These vanished metropolises are not merely relics of the past, they are open books, and their pages are written in stone and soil, telling stories of astonishing achievement and, ultimately, catastrophic failure. And these stories are not just academic curiosities, they are urgent, vital messages meant for us, for the cities we live in today. We are about to embark on a journey into the heart of this mystery, exploring the echoes of collapse and what our modern urban centers can learn from these vanished metropolises. From the jungle-shrouded pyramids of the Maya to the sprawling network of ancient Rome, we will walk through the ghostly remains of history's greatest urban experiments. We'll analyze the precise moments their complex systems began to fray, the critical decisions that were made or ignored, and the cascading effects that turned thriving hubs of human innovation into cautionary tales. This is more than an archaeological tour. It's a forensic investigation into the breaking points of civilization itself, seeking answers to questions that directly impact our future. How does a city that seems invincible suddenly become vulnerable? What are the silent warning signs we might be missing today? This exploration promises not just fascinating history, but actionable wisdom. We will extract practical insights for urban planners, policymakers, and every concerned citizen who wonders about the resilience of their own community. We'll see how environmental mismanagement, social inequality, and economic short-sightedness have played out before with devastating consequences, and we'll identify the principles that can guide us toward building cities that are not just larger or smarter, but truly sustainable and enduring. So join me as we begin this voyage through time, listening closely to the whispers from the past. They have never had more to say to our present. Urban collapse rarely arrives as a single, dramatic event like in the movies. It's not one earthquake or one invading army that does the deed, though those can be the final blow. Instead, it's a slow unraveling, a process where the intricate threads holding a society together begin to fray one by one. Think of a city not as a collection of buildings, but as a living, breathing organism. Its economy is the circulatory system, moving resources and value. Its social structures and governance are the nervous system, making decisions and coordinating action. And its environment is the life support system, providing the essential air, water, and food. Collapse occurs when these systems begin to fail each other, creating a cascade of failure that the society can no longer control or reverse. This process often begins with a core vulnerability, a weakness that has been papered over during times of plenty. For many ancient cities, this was a precarious relationship with their immediate environment. A civilization might achieve incredible sophistication in architecture and art, yet base its entire existence on an agricultural system that is slowly depleting the very soil it depends on. They might build a vast network of trade to bring in luxury goods and staple foods, creating the illusion of abundance while masking a deep local scarcity. This creates a fragile kind of prosperity, one that looks impressive on the surface but is vulnerable to the slightest shock. A few years of drought, a shift in trade routes, or a new disease can be enough to send the entire delicate structure tumbling down. What makes this unraveling so insidious is the convergence of multiple stressors. It's rarely just one problem. Environmental degradation might lead to crop failure. Crop failure leads to economic hardship and rising food prices. Economic hardship fuels social unrest and erodes trust in governing institutions. A weakened government is then less able to mount an effective response to the next crisis, whether it's an external threat or another environmental disaster. These stressors feed into each other, creating a feedback loop of decline. A society that could have weathered any one of these challenges in isolation finds itself overwhelmed when they all arrive at once. This is the nature of the breaking point, the moment when the combined weight of these interconnected problems exceeds the society's capacity to adapt. For us today, this perspective is crucial because it changes how we look at our own cities. We often focus on single, visible issues: a housing crisis, traffic congestion, or a recession. But the lesson from history is to look for the connections between these issues. The true risk lies in the invisible links between our financial systems, our energy grids, our social cohesion, and our local ecosystems. Are we, like those ancient civilizations, creating incredible complexity without building in enough resilience? Are we masking fundamental vulnerabilities with temporary technological fixes? Understanding collapse as a slow process gives us the greatest gift, the gift of early warning. It allows us to look for the fraying threads in our own social fabric and environmental support systems before they begin to snap. By studying how great cities of the past crossed their tipping points, we can learn to recognize our own and perhaps, just perhaps, choose a different path. Deep within the lush rainforests of Central America, the stone remnants of a once vibrant civilization stand as a haunting testament to nature's ultimate authority. The Maya achieved what many ancient peoples could only dream of, constructing vast city-states like Tikal and Palenque with pyramids that scraped the sky, developing a writing system more sophisticated than any in the Americas, and tracking celestial movements with astonishing precision. Their astronomers could predict solar eclipses centuries in advance, and their mathematicians conceived of the zero, a concept that would elude European thinkers for hundreds of years. This was a culture at the peak of human achievement, a civilization that must have felt utterly permanent, its future seemingly guaranteed by its own brilliance. Yet, within a surprisingly short period, these great urban centers fell silent, their grand plazas empty, their temples reclaimed by the relentless jungle. The unraveling began not with invasion or war, but with something far more mundane yet infinitely more powerful, a changing relationship with the environment that sustained them. To feed their growing populations and build their magnificent cities, the Maya engaged in widespread deforestation, clearing vast tracts of forest for agriculture and using the wood for construction and the production of lime plaster, a key building material that required burning enormous quantities of limestone in massive kilns. This deforestation set in motion a devastating chain reaction. Without tree roots to anchor it, the thin tropical soil began to wash away during heavy rains, silting up the reservoirs and agricultural terraces that were crucial for survival. The loss of forest cover also altered local climate patterns, reducing the moisture recycling that creates rainfall, which in turn made the region more susceptible to drought, a vulnerability that would prove catastrophic. When the droughts came, they weren't merely bad seasons but multi-decade megadroughts that pushed the Maya's sophisticated water management systems beyond their breaking point. Core samples from lakes across the region show dramatic decreases in rainfall during the critical collapse period between 800 and 900 CE. The magnificent reservoirs and canals that had sustained cities through normal dry seasons simply couldn't cope with this new reality. As water levels dropped, competition for this precious resource intensified, not just between cities but within them. The ruling elites, who derived their power partly from their perceived ability to intercede with the gods for rain and abundance, found their authority crumbling as their rituals failed and their promises rang hollow. The social contract between rulers and ruled began to fracture under the strain of thirst and hunger. This environmental pressure exposed and exacerbated existing social fragilities. Archaeological evidence shows that during the collapse, the magnificent ceremonial centers were abandoned first, while outlying villages persisted for some time. This suggests that common people may have lost faith in the ruling class's ability to solve the mounting crises. Imagine the growing disillusionment as priests continued to conduct rain ceremonies while reservoirs remained empty, as nobles demanded tribute from farmers whose fields produced nothing but dust. The intricate network of trade between city-states that distributed resources throughout the region began to break down as each center turned inward, hoarding what little it had. This loss of cooperation made recovery impossible, transforming what might have been a manageable crisis into a civilization-ending catastrophe. The Maya collapse offers a powerful lesson in interconnected vulnerability. Their story wasn't one of a single cause but of a cascade of failures. Environmental degradation leading to resource scarcity, which triggered social unrest and political collapse, which then eliminated any coordinated capacity to respond to the original environmental crisis. They remind us that technological sophistication is no guarantee of survival when it isn't paired with ecological wisdom. A society can map the heavens with breathtaking accuracy, yet fail to notice the slow degradation of the very ground beneath its feet. For modern cities, the warning is clear. Our concrete canyons and technological marvels exist within natural systems that cannot be ignored indefinitely. The Maya didn't vanish because they were primitive. They collapsed despite being advanced because they failed to maintain the balance between their ambitions and their environment's capacity to sustain them. While the Maya story shows a civilization succumbing to internal environmental pressures, the Roman Empire presents a different kind of cautionary tale, one of a system that grew so vast and interconnected that its very size became its greatest weakness. At its peak, Rome wasn't just a city, it was the pulsating heart of a massive urban network, a web of trade and administration stretching from the rainy highlands of Britain to the arid deserts of Egypt. Magnificent stone-paved roads, some so well built they are still visible today, carried legions to secure distant borders and allowed goods to flow from every corner of the known world into the capital. This system created unprecedented wealth and stability, enabling a standard of living in ancient Rome that wouldn't be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. The empire seemed like an unstoppable machine, a permanent fixture of the world order. Yet this magnificent edifice didn't collapse suddenly. It underwent a long, slow process of unraveling that holds critical lessons about the fragility of complex systems. This gradual decline was fueled in large part by imperial overextension. Maintaining such a vast territory required an enormous professional army, a bloated bureaucracy, and continuous investment in infrastructure thousands of miles from the capital. The financial strain was immense. To fund these ever-growing expenses, emperors began debasing the currency, reducing the precious metal content in coins while demanding they be accepted at the same face value. This was essentially ancient inflation, a silent tax that eroded the savings of ordinary citizens and merchants alike. A soldier's salary, once enough to buy a decent plot of land upon retirement, gradually became worthless, undermining the very loyalty of the army that protected the empire's frontiers. The economic foundation of urban life grew shaky as trust in the money system faded and a complex barter economy began to re-emerge, making large-scale trade and administration increasingly difficult. Perhaps the most critical vulnerability was the empire's deep dependency on long, fragile supply lines. The city of Rome itself became a parasite on its own provinces, utterly reliant on grain shipments from North Africa and Egypt to feed its massive population. For centuries, the steady arrival of these grain fleets was a symbol of Roman power and organizational genius, but this dependence created a terrifying vulnerability. A single bad harvest overseas, a piracy outbreak, or a political rebellion in a key province could trigger immediate food shortages and panic in the capital. The entire urban system was built on the assumption that these external flows would never be interrupted. When climate changes in the 3rd century led to droughts in key agricultural regions, and when political instability made Mediterranean shipping lanes more dangerous, this assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The very networks that had built Roman prosperity now became channels through which crises could spread uncontrollably. Compounding these economic and logistical problems was a political system that grew increasingly corrupt and ineffective at responding to mounting threats. In the later empire, the throne became a prize to be seized by the strongest general, leading to constant civil wars that diverted military resources away from defending the borders. Emperors focused on short-term survival and placating the army, had little capacity for the long-term planning needed to address systemic issues like soil exhaustion in Italy or the rising threat of Germanic tribes. The vast bureaucracy, once a marvel of administration, became sclerotic and self-serving, more focused on internal squabbles and extracting wealth from the provinces than on effective governance. This political infighting meant that even when clear problems were identified, such as the need to encourage local food production in Italy, the empire often lacked the collective will or stability to implement solutions. The Roman case study teaches us that stability can sometimes conceal profound weakness. Their infrastructure was magnificent, but it created a system with very little redundancy or flexibility. When shocks occurred, whether economic, environmental, or military, the entire network was affected. There were no backup plans, no local systems resilient enough to operate independently if the central flow of goods and commands was disrupted. For modern cities, the parallel is striking. We too have built incredibly efficient but highly centralized systems for energy, food, and finance. A cyber attack on a financial network, a drought in an agricultural region that supplies a continent, or a pandemic that halts global trade. These are modern versions of the Roman grain fleet failing to arrive. The lesson isn't to abandon complexity and global connection, but to build in resilience, local food production, decentralized energy grids, and redundant systems that can keep a city functioning even when its longest supply lines are cut. The Romans believed their complex systems were their greatest strength. History shows they also contain the seeds of their greatest vulnerability. Now consider a story of collapse that unfolds not across a continent, but on a single, breathtakingly remote island in the vast Pacific Ocean. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, presents us with one of history's most stark and unsettling parables about the consequences of ecological disregard. Imagine this place as it was first settled by Polynesian voyagers around 1200 CE, a pristine paradise covered in a thick forest of giant palm trees, a thriving ecosystem supporting diverse bird life and surrounded by waters rich with fish. This isolated community flourished, developing a unique and complex culture that expressed its spiritual beliefs and social status through the creation of the iconic moai, those enormous stone figures that stare silently inland from their ceremonial platforms. For centuries, the society prospered, its population growing, its artists and engineers achieving ever more ambitious projects. Yet, this very success contained the seeds of its own destruction, a grim reminder that no society, no matter how isolated, is immune to the laws of nature. The central tragedy of Easter Island lies in its people's relationship with their most vital resource, the forest. The towering palm trees were the island's ecological foundation, and they were used for almost everything. Wood was needed to build rollers and levers for transporting the massive moai statues, some weighing over 80 tons, from the quarry to their coastal platforms. It was essential for constructing sturdy seafaring canoes capable of harvesting deep-sea fish like tuna, a crucial protein source. The forest also provided materials for homes, fuel for fires, and most importantly, its roots held the island's thin volcanic soil firmly in place, preventing erosion and retaining moisture for agriculture. For generations, the consumption of this resource was likely sustainable, but as the population grew and the cultural drive to erect larger and more numerous statues intensified, the rate of consumption began to outpace the forest's ability to regenerate. Tree by tree, the island was being systematically deforested for both practical necessity and cultural ambition. The consequences of this deforestation were not gradual, they were catastrophic and cascading. Without trees to protect it, the fertile topsoil washed away with every rain, drastically reducing agricultural yields of staple crops like sweet potatoes and yams. The loss of the great palms meant the end of ocean-going canoe construction, severing the islanders' access to the deep-sea fish that had once been a dietary mainstay and confining them to less productive inshore waters. The disappearance of forest habitat also led to the extinction of the island's native land birds, another source of food. Suddenly, a society that had once enjoyed a diverse and abundant diet found itself struggling to feed a large population on a rapidly diminishing resource base. The very cultural achievements that defined their civilization, the magnificent moai, had directly undermined their ability to feed themselves. As resources became desperately scarce, the social fabric of the island tore apart. The same elite class of chiefs and priests who had directed the statue construction and who derived their authority from their connection to the gods and ancestors represented by the moai found their power crumbling. When their rituals failed to bring back the forests or the fish, their legitimacy vanished. Archaeological evidence reveals a period of intense internal conflict. Spear tips made of obsidian become increasingly common in the later layers of soil, and oral traditions tell of warfare between clans. The grand statues, once objects of veneration, were toppled from their platforms, perhaps by rival groups or by a populace that had lost faith in the old gods and the leaders who served them. Society devolved into a brutal struggle for survival, and in a final, horrifying turn, some evidence suggests cannibalism may have emerged as a result of extreme famine. The islanders had literally consumed the foundation of their own society. Easter Island's story is a powerful microcosm of a challenge every civilization faces: the tension between short-term cultural ambitions and long-term ecological stability. The islanders were not stupid. They were responding to the powerful incentives of their culture, which placed immense value on honoring ancestors through statue construction. But they failed to recognize the environmental feedback telling them they were exceeding their island's carrying capacity. Their world was small, and the warning signs should have been unmistakable, yet they continued on their path. For our modern global civilization, the parallels are chillingly clear. While we are not confined to a single island, we all share the same isolated planet with its finite resources. Our own monument building, whether in the form of relentless economic growth, urban sprawl, or consumption-driven status, often comes at the expense of the ecological systems that ultimately support us. Easter Island stands as a stark, solitary monument to a simple, inescapable truth. When a culture's demands consistently outpace nature's capacity to renew, collapse is not a possibility, it is a mathematical certainty. Now we travel to the heart of North America, to the fertile floodplains of the Mississippi River, where a sprawling metropolis once rose from the land, a city of earth and timber that rivaled contemporary London in size. This was Cahokia, the crown jewel of the Mississippian culture, a bustling urban center that at its peak around 1050 CE was home to perhaps 20,000 people. Its skyline was dominated by Monk's Mound, an enormous earthen pyramid larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza, flanked by over 100 other mounds that served as platforms for temples, elite residences, and ceremonial structures. A massive wooden stockade, 2 miles in circumference and studded with defensive watchtowers, encircled the city's core. Grand plazas hosted lively markets trading goods from across the continent, while outlying neighborhoods and farming settlements stretched for miles along the river. This was a planned city, a testament to sophisticated engineering and social organization, a place that must have felt like the very center of the world to its inhabitants. Yet within 3 centuries, this great city was completely abandoned, its structures left to decay, its story largely forgotten until archaeologists began piecing together its dramatic history. The success of Cahokia was built on a foundation of agricultural abundance, specifically the cultivation of maize. The rich floodplain soils, replenished annually by the Mississippi, produced enormous harvests that could support a dense urban population and a complex society with a ruling class of priests and nobles who did not farm themselves. This agricultural surplus fueled everything. It allowed for the specialization of labor, enabling the construction of monumental earthworks that required moving an estimated 55 million cubic feet of soil entirely by hand, basket by basket. It supported artisans, traders, and a powerful political hierarchy. However, this very dependence on a single staple crop, grown intensively on the same land, created a profound vulnerability. As the population grew, the demand for food pushed agriculture onto more marginal lands surrounding the city, leading to widespread deforestation to clear new fields. Archaeological studies of soil cores show alarming rates of erosion beginning around 1200 CE, indicating that the fertile topsoil was washing away faster than it could be replenished, slowly degrading the land's productivity. This environmental pressure was dramatically compounded by a changing climate. Tree ring data from across the region tells a story of significant climatic shifts during Cahokia's later years. A period of unusually warm and wet weather, perfect for agriculture, likely facilitated the city's initial explosive growth, but this was followed by a stark transition into a much cooler and drier period, part of a global climate event known as the Little Ice Age. Prolonged droughts would have placed immense strain on Cahokia's maize-based economy, reducing crop yields at the very moment the city's population was near its peak. The same river that had given life could also become a threat. Evidence suggests major flood events also occurred, scouring the already depleted farmland. The city was caught in a pincer movement of environmental stresses. Its soil was exhausted from within, while the climate turned against it from without. The social and political structure of Cahokia, which had been the engine of its greatness, likely became a liability in this time of crisis. The society was highly stratified, with a powerful ruler, often called the Great Sun, residing atop Monk's Mound and presiding over a complex chiefdom. This hierarchy was maintained through control of the agricultural surplus, the distribution of prestige goods, and the performance of elaborate religious ceremonies meant to ensure fertility and order. When the environmental conditions deteriorated and harvests began to fail, the authority of this elite would have been severely undermined. If the priests' ceremonies could not bring rain and the chiefs could not provide food, their divine right to rule would be called into question. The enormous investment in monumental construction, while a source of spiritual and political power, may have also diverted crucial labor away from essential tasks like managing food storage, building irrigation systems, or adapting agricultural practices flexibility that was desperately needed as conditions changed. The end of Cahokia was not a single event but a gradual process of dispersal. Rather than a dramatic invasion or catastrophe, the archaeology points to a slow unraveling. People began to leave, not all at once, but in groups, likely moving back to smaller, more sustainable villages along smaller river tributaries where they could return to a mixed hunting, gathering, and farming economy. The complex social and political system that required a massive surplus to sustain itself simply could not be maintained without that surplus. The city was abandoned not to the jungle like the Maya cities, but to the prairie grasses and forests which slowly reclaimed the mounds and plazas. By the time European explorers arrived centuries later, they saw only enigmatic, grass-covered hills, having no idea they were looking upon the ruins of the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico. Cahokia's story is a powerful lesson in the peril of building a magnificent civilization on an ecological borderline. Their entire way of life was perfectly adapted to a specific set of environmental conditions, a warm, wet climate and fertile, replenished soils. When those conditions changed even slightly, the entire edifice became precarious. It teaches us that urban resilience isn't just about strength during good times, but about building in flexibility and diversity to withstand inevitable change. A food system dependent on one crop, a political system dependent on uninterrupted surplus, and a physical infrastructure that consumes resources without renewal. These are recipes for vulnerability. Cahokia's silent mounds stand as a monument to a sophisticated society that mastered its environment brilliantly until its environment changed and its mastery was revealed to be a fragile kind of perfection. The intricate web of streets and structures we navigate every day is far more than a random collection of buildings. It is a living blueprint, a physical manifestation of our priorities and our understanding of how people thrive. While we often think of advanced urban planning as a modern achievement, a look back at ancient cities reveals a startling truth. Many foundational principles of creating healthy, sustainable, and resilient urban environments were not just understood but masterfully implemented millennia ago. These ancient blueprints offer us a treasure trove of tested wisdom, showing us what works, what fails, and how the very design of a city can be its greatest strength or its most fatal flaw. Consider the sheer brilliance of Roman engineering, which extended far beyond the famous roads and aqueducts. Their commitment to public health was embedded directly into the urban fabric. The Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest sewer systems, was a monumental feat that channeled waste away from populated areas and into the Tiber River, drastically reducing the spread of waterborne diseases that would plague later European cities for centuries. This was complemented by the aqueducts, which delivered fresh, clean water from distant mountain sources directly into public fountains, baths, and even the homes of the wealthy. This guaranteed a reliable water supply for drinking, cooking, and sanitation, creating a separation between clean and dirty water that was revolutionary for its time. The Romans intuitively understood that a city's vitality was directly linked to the health of its citizens, and they designed their infrastructure accordingly, a lesson in prioritizing public wellness that remains profoundly relevant. On the other side of the world, the Maya civilization developed an equally sophisticated but entirely different approach to a critical resource: water. In the seasonal rainforests of Mesoamerica, the challenge wasn't importing water but managing its feast or famine cycle. Their solution was an elaborate system of reservoirs, canals, and paved plazas designed to capture, store, and distribute rainwater. The city of Tikal, for instance, featured massive reservoirs lined with clay to prevent seepage, which could hold millions of gallons of water to see the population through the long dry season. Their central plazas were not merely public spaces, they were engineered to slope gently toward these reservoirs, functioning as giant catchment basins during torrential rains. This integration of architecture and hydrology shows a profound understanding of working with local environmental cycles rather than fighting against them, a cornerstone of sustainable design that modern cities striving for water independence are now trying to relearn. For a cautionary tale in urban design, we need only look to the crowded, warren-like streets of many medieval European towns. As they grew organically within protective walls, space was at a premium, leading to narrow, crooked alleys where overhanging timber-framed buildings blotted out the sunlight. These dark, damp conditions, combined with the common practice of dumping human waste into the streets, created a perfect breeding ground for disease. The Black Death swept through these urban environments with devastating efficiency, in part because the design of the cities themselves facilitated its spread. This stark historical contrast teaches us the critical importance of sunlight and ventilation, what we might now call public health infrastructure. It underscores that a city's layout isn't just about aesthetics. It can literally be a matter of life and death, pushing modern planners to prioritize green spaces, wide boulevards, and access to fresh air and light. Perhaps the most astonishing ancient example of premeditated urban design comes from the Indus Valley civilization and its crown jewel, Mohenjo-Daro, which flourished over 4,000 years ago. This city was built on a meticulously planned grid pattern with wide main streets and narrower lanes, all aligning to a precise orientation, but the real genius lay in the details. The city utilized standardized, kiln-fired bricks of a uniform size, suggesting a remarkable level of central planning and quality control. Most impressively, nearly every house contained a bathing area and was connected to a city-wide, covered drainage system that ran beneath the streets. Wastewater was channeled from homes into these brick-lined sewers, which featured manholes for maintenance, all leading to outskirts away from living areas. This created a culture of hygiene and civic order that would not be seen again on such a scale for thousands of years. Mohenjo-Daro stands as a powerful testament to the idea that a city's longevity is built not just on grand monuments, but on the humble, unseen infrastructure that promotes cleanliness, health, and communal well-being. These historical examples collectively reveal that the principles of good urban planning are timeless. They are not modern inventions, but rather enduring truths about human habitation that different cultures have discovered and implemented time and again. The Romans championed public health through engineered water systems. The Maya mastered the art of working within their environmental constraints. The medieval era, through its failures, taught us the vital necessity of light and air. And the Indus Valley civilization demonstrated that standardization, order, and sanitation are the bedrock of a functioning metropolis. Examining these ancient blueprints is not an academic exercise, it is a practical guide. It helps us identify which design elements truly contribute to long-term urban viability, reminding us that the most forward-thinking city of the future might just be the one that wisely incorporates the best lessons from the distant past. This relentless pursuit of growth without regard for natural limits is perhaps the most consistent thread running through the stories of fallen cities. They operated on what we might call a linear economy, a system of take, make, and dispose. Resources were extracted from the environment, transformed into goods and structures, and eventually discarded as waste with little thought given to the renewal cycle. This model works only as long as there are new frontiers to exploit, new forests to cut, new soils to farm. But on a finite planet, or within the confined valley of a civilization, those frontiers eventually vanish and the linear system begins to consume itself. The stark lesson from history is that a city's lifespan is determined not by the grandeur of its buildings, but by the wisdom of its resource metabolism, the way it consumes, uses, and replenishes the natural capital that supports it. Consider the remarkable case of the ancestral Puebloans, often called the Anasazi, who built their intricate cliff dwellings into the canyon walls of the American Southwest. In an environment that receives less than 10 inches of rain a year, every drop of water was precious. Their survival was a masterpiece of meticulous conservation. They engineered sophisticated networks of cisterns to capture runoff from mesa tops, built check dams and terraces to slow erosion and allow water to percolate into the soil, and carefully oriented their homes to maximize shade and minimize water loss. They lived within their means, creating a society that thrived for centuries in a landscape that seems utterly inhospitable to large-scale settlement. Their success was a testament to a deep, observant understanding of their local ecology and a cultural commitment to working within its constraints. Yet, even their sophisticated systems had a breaking point. Around the 13th century, a profound megadrought lasting decades gripped the region. Tree ring data reveals years of almost no rainfall whatsoever. The carefully managed water reserves, the terraced fields, the stored grain, all of it was eventually exhausted by a drought so severe and prolonged that it exceeded the adaptive capacity they had so brilliantly developed. There was simply no more water to conserve. This teaches us a nuanced but critical lesson. Sustainable practices are necessary, but they may not be sufficient in the face of unprecedented environmental shifts. It underscores the importance of building not just for the average conditions, but for the extreme edges of possibility, designing systems with enough buffer and flexibility to withstand shocks that lie outside historical experience. A similar story of brilliant engineering ultimately meeting its match unfolds in the rose-red city of Petra, carved into the sandstone cliffs of Jordan. The Nabateans who built it were geniuses of hydraulic engineering in a desert environment. They constructed a vast and complex system to harness water, carving channels into the cliff faces to divert seasonal flash floods, building dams and reservoirs to control the torrents, and creating underground cisterns to store water for the dry periods. This system supported a population of perhaps 30,000 people, turning a desert crossroads into a magnificent urban center that controlled the lucrative trade routes for incense and spices. The city itself was a monument to the power of water management, but Petra's existence was tied to more than just its water systems. It was fundamentally a node in a globalized ancient economy. When the Romans established new sea routes to India and the Far East, the overland caravan trade that was Petra's lifeblood began to dwindle. As the wealth flowing through the city declined, so did the resources and collective will needed to maintain its brilliant but demanding water infrastructure. The intricate network of channels and cisterns, which required constant cleaning and repair to prevent siltation and collapse, began to decay. A system designed to last forever was abandoned within a few generations, not because the knowledge was lost, but because the economic engine that funded its maintenance had vanished. Petra's fate illustrates a terrifying vulnerability of modern cities. Even the most advanced infrastructure is not a one-time investment. It is a living system that requires perpetual care, funded by a stable economic base. When that base erodes, the physical foundations of urban life can crumble with shocking speed. The fundamental takeaway from these stories is the concept of a circular economy and system where waste is designed out and materials are constantly reused and regenerated. Ancient cities rarely achieved this. They were largely linear, and that linearity was their undoing. Modern cities have the knowledge to do better. We can move beyond simply managing waste to eliminating the very concept of waste, seeing everything from wastewater to food scraps to demolition debris as a potential resource. Imagine a city that treats its sewage not as a problem to be disposed of, but as a source of nutrients for agriculture and biogas for energy. Imagine construction practices that design buildings for disassembly, so their components can be reused rather than landfilled. This isn't just an environmental ideal. It is the practical lesson written into the dust of every vanished metropolis that consumed its future to feed its present. A city's true wealth is not measured by its annual extraction of new resources, but by its skill in circulating and renewing the resources it already has. A city's economy is its lifeblood, the constant pulse of exchange and activity that powers everything from its grandest monuments to its most humble households. But history delivers a sobering verdict on how that economic lifeblood is managed. Those urban centers that placed all their bets on a single industry, no matter how powerful or profitable, ultimately built their foundations on sand. The relentless tide of change, technological disruption, shifting trade routes, evolving consumer tastes, has a way of washing away even the most dominant monopolies, leaving behind communities that are suddenly economically stranded. The choice between diversification and specialization is not merely a matter of economic policy. It is a fundamental question of urban survival. Consider the breathtaking ascent and slow, graceful decline of Venice. For centuries, La Serenissima was the undisputed queen of Mediterranean commerce, a maritime empire whose wealth and power were built entirely on its mastery of trade. Its merchant galleys and naval fleets controlled the flow of spices, silk, and other luxuries between Europe and the East, creating a city of unimaginable opulence rising from the lagoons. Venetian ducats were the trusted currency across the known world, but this magnificent success contained the seed of its own vulnerability. The entire Venetian identity and economy were hyper-specialized around a single geographic reality, the Mediterranean Sea as the center of global trade. When Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama pioneered new oceanic routes around Africa, bypassing the Mediterranean entirely, Venice's strategic advantage evaporated almost overnight. The lifeblood of its economy was diverted to a new circulatory system, and the city, though it remained beautiful and culturally significant, gradually transitioned from a global economic powerhouse to a historical monument. Its specialization, the very source of its greatness, became its greatest liability when the world changed around it. This pattern would repeat itself with brutal clarity centuries later and an ocean away in Detroit, Michigan. In the early 20th century, Detroit wasn't just a city that made cars. It was the automotive capital of the world, a roaring engine of American industrial might. The Big Three automakers provided hundreds of thousands of high-paying jobs, creating a prosperous middle class and funding a golden age of civic infrastructure. But like Venice, Detroit's entire identity became fused with a single industry. When global competition, changing consumer preferences, and automation began to erode the dominance of American auto manufacturing, the city had no backup plan. The tax base evaporated, unemployment soared, and a once vibrant metropolis entered a spiral of depopulation and decay. The parallel is haunting. Both Venice and Detroit became victims of their own spectacular success, proving that no industry, no matter how mighty, is permanent. A city that thrives on one thing can very easily die by that one thing. The counterexample, the model of resilience, is found in the ancient city of Constantinople. For over 1,000 years, through sieges, plagues, and shifting political fortunes, the capital of the Byzantine Empire endured where others fell. Its secret was a breathtakingly diverse economic portfolio. It wasn't just a political capital, it was a manufacturing hub renowned for its luxury goods like silk and glassware. It was a cultural and religious center that attracted pilgrims and scholars. Most importantly, it occupied the ultimate strategic location, a natural crossroads controlling the Bosporus Strait, the critical choke point between Europe and Asia. This meant that even if one trade route was disrupted, others remained open. If one industry suffered, others could pick up the slack. This economic diversification created a remarkable buffer against shock. While other cities rose and fell with the fate of a single commodity or trade route, Constantinople's multiple revenue streams allowed it to adapt, absorb blows, and persist through crises that would have shattered a less balanced economy. Perhaps the most stark warning against economic overspecialization comes from the ghost towns that dot landscapes from the American West to the Australian outback. These were places born from a single extractive purpose: gold, silver, coal, or oil. They boomed almost overnight, with saloons and banks and neighborhoods springing up to serve the rush of miners and speculators. Wealth flowed freely, but it was almost entirely temporary, based on sucking a finite resource from the ground. Little to no investment was made in building a diversified local economy, educational institutions, or lasting community infrastructure. Everyone understood on some level that they were living on borrowed time. When the resource ran out or the market crashed, the entire reason for the town's existence vanished. The money disappeared, the people left, and all that remained were skeletal buildings and silent streets, a powerful monument to the emptiness of an economy built on extraction without renewal. For modern cities, the lesson is urgent and clear. In a globalized world of rapid technological change, economic resilience is not a luxury, it is a necessity. The goal cannot be to find the one perfect industry and ride it forever. Instead, the goal must be to cultivate a dynamic ecosystem of large anchors, small startups, skilled artisans, and creative industries. It requires foresight to invest in emerging sectors: renewable energy, biotechnology, digital services before the old pillars begin to crumble. It means supporting education systems that create a flexible, adaptable workforce and building quality of life amenities that attract a diverse range of talent. A resilient city is not defined by what it produces today, but by its capacity to learn, adapt, and produce something new tomorrow. The ghosts of specialized pasts urge us to look beyond the immediate boom and build economies that are not just wealthy, but wise, durable, and deeply rooted in more than a single claim to fame. Yet a city's most brilliant infrastructure and most abundant resources mean very little if its people are fundamentally disconnected from one another. Beyond the stone and steel, beyond the aqueducts and granaries, lies the true heart of urban resilience, the invisible web of trust, reciprocity, and shared identity that binds a community together. This social cohesion is the unseen mortar that holds the bricks of civilization in place, and when it begins to crumble, even the most physically robust cities can falter under pressure. The archaeological record from numerous collapsed societies offers a hauntingly consistent diagnosis. A terminal illness of the social spirit often precedes the final physical collapse. We see this vividly in the final centuries of the Western Roman Empire, where a profound social fracture developed between the immensely wealthy, landed aristocracy and the vast population of urban poor. The elite, ensconced in their lavish villas, became increasingly disconnected from the daily struggles of the common citizen. They viewed civic leadership and tax contributions not as duties, but as burdens to be avoided, retreating into private luxury while public infrastructure like roads, aqueducts, and city walls decayed from neglect. This created a devastating feedback loop. As the elites withdrew their wealth and engagement from public life, the government's ability to provide basic services and security eroded. This erosion, in turn, further convinced the wealthy that investing in the common good was futile, leading them to hoard resources and hire private guards instead of supporting a collective legion. The concept of a shared Roman identity, once a powerful unifying force, fragmented into a collection of self-interested groups who no longer believed they were in the same boat. When the Goths arrived at the gates, the city's physical walls were still formidable, but its social walls had already been breached from within by distrust and disunity. A similar story of social unraveling is etched into the final monuments of the classic Maya. In their heyday, Maya society was held together by a powerful compact. The common people provided labor and agricultural surplus, and in return, the ruling elite, the Agor, or holy lords, provided spiritual intercession, organized large-scale projects, and ensured cosmic order. This compact was symbolized by the magnificent ceremonial centers and the elaborate rituals performed there. However, as prolonged drought strained agricultural production, this social contract broke down. The elites, likely desperate to maintain their status and ritual obligations, may have demanded even more tribute from a population already facing hunger. The grand temples and palaces, once symbols of shared prosperity and divine favor, became stark reminders of a ruling class that was either unable or unwilling to solve the mounting crisis. The common people, losing faith in the spiritual and practical power of their leaders, likely began to withdraw their support. They stopped maintaining the reservoirs, they stopped contributing to new construction, and ultimately, they simply walked away from the great cities, dispersing into smaller, more flexible communities where trust could be rebuilt on a human scale. In stark contrast, history also provides powerful examples of cities where strong social bonds created remarkable resilience. Medieval European cities, for all their sanitary shortcomings, were often bound by incredibly strong guild systems and religious affiliations. These networks provided not just economic support but a profound sense of belonging and mutual obligation. If a fire destroyed a craftsman's workshop, his guild brothers would help him rebuild. If a family fell into poverty, the church and community would provide alms. This dense web of social capital meant that hardships were absorbed collectively rather than individually, preventing a localized crisis from spiraling into a societal collapse. The city functioned as an extended family with all the messy, complicated, but ultimately vital bonds that such a structure implies. Modern sociology has given us a term for this vital resource: social capital. It refers to the networks of relationships among people who live and work in a society, enabling that society to function effectively. Think of it as a form of civic trust that acts as a lubricant, reducing the friction and transaction costs of working together. During a crisis, this social capital becomes as critical as any physical infrastructure. A neighborhood with high social capital will self-organize to check on elderly residents during a heat wave, share generators after a hurricane, or form a community watch during civil unrest. This isn't a vague feeling of goodwill. It is a tangible, deployable asset that directly impacts survival and recovery rates. Cities can actively invest in building this capital by designing inclusive public spaces like parks and plazas that encourage interaction across social lines. They can support community institutions, libraries, recreation centers, local festivals that foster a shared sense of identity and place. Perhaps most importantly, they can pursue policies that promote equity and fairness, because nothing erodes social trust faster than the perception that the system is rigged for the benefit of a few. The lesson from the past is clear. A city can have the strongest walls, the most sophisticated water systems, and the most abundant grain stores, but if its citizens see each other not as neighbors but as competitors for a shrinking pie, those material advantages will prove useless in a true emergency. Resilience is not just stored in warehouses. It is woven into the everyday interactions, the shared public celebrations, the willingness to lend a tool to a neighbor, and the deeply held belief that we are all in this together. The strength of a city is ultimately measured not by the height of its skyline, but by the depth of its human connections. When a crisis strikes, be it a prolonged drought, an invading army, or a sudden catastrophe, the true test of a city begins. It is in these moments of extreme pressure that the quality of governance is laid bare, revealing whether a society's leadership will be its saving grace or its fatal weakness. The stark difference between recovery and collapse often comes down to a simple question: did those in power have the vision, the flexibility, and the trust of their people to guide the city through the storm? History offers us a fascinating laboratory of governance models, each with its own strengths and tragic flaws, providing a clear playbook for what works when everything is on the line. Consider the brilliant, yet ultimately fragile, experiment of the ancient Greek city-states, particularly Athens. Here, the concept of participatory democracy was born, a revolutionary idea that empowered a broad segment of male citizens to have a direct voice in their own governance. This system was incredibly effective at mobilizing collective action and fostering a powerful sense of civic ownership. When faced with the existential threat of the Persian invasions, this shared identity and the ability to debate and decide strategy collectively created a formidable resilience. Citizens were fighting for their own city, their own laws, their own chosen path. However, this very strength contained a critical vulnerability: political fragmentation. The Greek world was a constellation of independent city-states, often more invested in rivalries and petty wars with each other than in presenting a unified front. This lack of larger-scale coordination meant that even as individual cities demonstrated incredible internal resilience, they remained vulnerable to external threats that required a broader, collective response. Their model excelled at mobilizing a single polis but failed to create lasting alliances, a lesson in the dangers of hyper-localism in an interconnected world. On the opposite end of the governance spectrum lies the awe-inspiring achievement of the Khmer Empire at Anchor. Theirs was a model of breathtaking centralized coordination, a top-down hierarchy capable of marshalling resources on an almost unimaginable scale. The crown jewel of this system was the elaborate water management network surrounding Angkor Wat, a complex grid of reservoirs, canals, and barrays, massive water tanks that allowed the city to thrive in a climate with a punishingly long dry season. This system required a powerful god-king ruler and a vast bureaucracy to plan, build, and maintain. For centuries, it worked magnificently, supporting one of the largest pre-industrial cities in the world. But this centralized strength became its greatest weakness when the climate began to change. Evidence suggests the region was hit by a series of intense monsoons and prolonged droughts in the 14th and 15th centuries that overwhelmed the intricate hydraulic system. The highly centralized governance structure, so effective in maintaining a static system, proved too rigid and slow to adapt. The entire society was built around the perfection of a single, complex solution. When that solution no longer matched the new environmental reality, the leadership lacked the local flexibility and innovative capacity to pivot. The system didn't just fail, it failed catastrophically because there was no plan B. These contrasting cases point toward a golden mean of effective crisis governance, a hybrid model that balances strong central coordination with empowered local flexibility. A central authority is essential for large-scale vision, redistributing resources from unaffected areas to disaster zones, and maintaining critical infrastructure that serves the whole. But this must be paired with local units, neighborhood councils, city districts, community organizations that have the autonomy and local knowledge to respond quickly to on-the-ground conditions. This structure creates resilience through redundancy. If one part of the system is damaged or paralyzed, other parts can continue to function. Furthermore, governance that incorporates diverse perspectives is far more likely to identify blind spots and generate creative solutions during a crisis. A ruling class that is isolated from the lived experience of its citizens will make decisions based on incomplete information, often with disastrous results. Accountability is the final, crucial piece. Leaders who are answerable to their people have a powerful incentive to perform effectively and ethically during a crisis, while unaccountable leaders can pursue disastrous policies without check, prioritizing their own survival over the city's. For modern mayors, city councils, and emergency planners, these ancient lessons are not abstract history. They are urgent, practical guides. It means building governance structures before the disaster strikes that clearly delineate authority while fostering communication across agencies and down to the community level. It means creating formal channels for citizen input and volunteer coordination, recognizing that the first responders in any crisis are often neighbors helping neighbors. It means investing in scenario planning that challenges assumptions and tests the flexibility of decision-making chains. The goal is to avoid the fate of Anchor, a paralysis by over-centralization, and the fate of the Greeks' vulnerability from fragmentation. Instead, the aim is to forge a responsive, agile governance model that can act decisively as one when necessary, and decentralize into 1,000 points of light when that is what survival requires. This intricate dance of command and adaptation, of authority and accountability, is what separates the cities that become lessons in collapse from those that write new chapters of renewal. The record of human history is written not only in grand monuments and epic battles, but also in the quiet, relentless struggle to adapt to a changing sky. Long before modern climate models, ancient civilizations were already facing the ultimate test of environmental shifts, and their responses, some brilliantly successful, others tragically rigid, offer us a masterclass in resilience written across millennia. This was not a matter of simple survival, but a complex dance between cultural identity, technological capability, and the sheer, unyielding will to change when the world itself begins to transform. Their stories reveal a profound truth. The ability to endure is not about having the most advanced tools, but about possessing the most adaptable mind. Consider the starkly different fates of two mighty river civilizations confronting similar climatic horrors. Around 2200 BCE, a catastrophic megadrought descended upon the Fertile Crescent, strangling the world's first true empire, the Akkadians of Mesopotamia. Their society was a marvel of centralized power and agricultural innovation, but it was built on a fragile premise: the reliable rainfall and river flow of a stable climate. When the rains failed for decades, their extensive irrigation networks from the Tigris and Euphrates began to run dry. The wheat fields withered, famine sparked social unrest, and the empire that Sargon the Great built simply crumbled into dust and warring city-states. Their system was magnificent, but it was also brittle, engineered for a specific set of conditions that vanished, leaving them with no plan B. Meanwhile, just across the desert, the ancient Egyptians faced a nearly identical climatic crisis. The same global drought that felled the Akkadians caused the Nile's annual inundation, the lifeblood of Egypt, to become weak and unreliable. Yet Egyptian civilization endured. Their secret lay in a fundamentally different relationship with their environment. Instead of complex, centralized irrigation that could fail, they relied on a simpler, more flexible system of basin irrigation. They built networks of earthen banks to capture the Nile's floodwaters, whatever their level, and used the natural slope of the land to distribute it. But more importantly, they had a culture of observation and adaptation. They developed sophisticated nilometers to measure the river's height, allowing for early prediction of lean harvests. This early warning system enabled the pharaoh's government to institute measures like grain storage and rationing, adjusting tax demands and redistributing resources to weather the hard years. They didn't try to fight the change, they learned to flow with it, and in doing so, they outlasted their mighty neighbors by thousands of years. This theme of cultural flexibility versus rigid tradition finds its most poignant example in the frozen cliffs of Greenland. Here, Norse settlers from Iceland established two thriving communities around 985 CE, building stone churches, dairy farms, and a society that mirrored the European world they left behind. For centuries, they clung to their identity as Christian farmers, raising cattle and sheep in a landscape increasingly hostile to such practices. As the Little Ice Age descended, bringing colder temperatures and longer sea ice that blocked trade routes, their situation grew dire. Malnutrition soared and their community slowly dwindled. Just a short distance away, the Inuit people thrived in the same harsh conditions. They possessed a technology and lifestyle perfectly adapted to the Arctic, seal hunting from kayaks, fishing through ice, and crafting warm clothing from animal skins. The archaeological record shows the Norse had contact with the Inuit and were aware of these superior techniques, yet they refused to adopt them. To do so would have meant abandoning the very cultural core of what it meant to be Norse, a pastoral European people. Their identity became their cage, and their settlements vanished into silence. Conversely, other Arctic communities provide stunning examples of successful adaptation. The ancestors of the modern Inuit, known as the Thule culture, undertook a massive migration eastward from Alaska around the year 1000, a move driven by a changing climate. They were expert whalers, and as warmer periods opened up new sea passages and shifted whale populations, they followed the opportunity, rapidly spreading across the North American Arctic. Their entire toolkit, from the Umiak boat to the toggle-headed harpoon, was designed for efficiency and mobility. When the climate shifted again, cooling into the Little Ice Age, they didn't collapse, they shifted their subsistence strategy. With whales less accessible, they turned their incredible skill set toward hunting smaller seals and caribou, demonstrating a fluidity in their livelihood that stood in stark contrast to the static Norse. Their culture was built not on a single, fixed way of life, but on a deep understanding of their environment and a readiness to pivot when it changed. The common thread running through these ancient stories is the critical importance of monitoring and heeding environmental indicators. The Egyptians with their nilometers were practicing a form of early climate science, using data to guide their adaptive response. Societies that paid close attention to the subtle signals of change, shifting animal migration patterns, altering tree ring growth, changing ocean currents, were often the ones that could get ahead of a crisis. They could see the drought coming and store more grain, sense the cooling temperatures and diversify their food sources, or observe the success of their neighbors and be humble enough to learn. The greatest failure was not a lack of technology, but a failure of imagination, the inability to conceive of a different way of being. For modern cities facing our own era of climate disruption, this is the most vital takeaway. Our challenge is not just to build higher seawalls or more efficient grids, but to cultivate a cultural capacity for change, to build institutions that are learning organizations rather than fortresses of tradition, and to remember that the strategies that made us successful in the past may not be the ones that will ensure our survival in the future. The most magnificent bridge, the most brilliant aqueduct, the most sophisticated network of roads, these achievements mean nothing if they are not constantly cared for. History reveals a silent killer of cities that is far less dramatic than invasion or natural disaster, but every bit as deadly: the slow, insidious decay of neglected infrastructure. We build with stone and concrete, materials that give the illusion of permanence, but the truth is that every human system is in a constant state of entropy, fighting a battle against time and the elements. The great civilizations of the past understood how to build for the ages, but their ultimate failure often lay in not understanding how to maintain for the ages. This neglect is a form of slow-motion suicide, where a society's greatest achievements gradually become the instruments of its own decline. Consider the legendary Roman aqueducts, those soaring arches that marched across the countryside, delivering life-giving water to bustling cities. They were not just static monuments, they were living, flowing systems that demanded constant, expert attention. Specialized crews of workers were perpetually employed to patrol the channels, cleaning out mineral deposits, repairing cracks in the lead linings, and ensuring the gentle, consistent slope of the watercourse was never compromised. This maintenance was a line item in the imperial budget, a non-negotiable cost of urban existence. But as the empire's economy faltered and political instability diverted funds to endless civil wars and border defense, these maintenance crews were likely among the first to be disbanded or defunded. A small crack would go unrepaired, leading to a leak which would erode the foundation, eventually causing a whole section to collapse. The water supply, that absolute prerequisite for urban life, would become intermittent, then unreliable, and finally a trickle. The city didn't fall because the aqueducts were destroyed in a day. It declined because the commitment to uphold them was destroyed over generations. This same pattern of decay through deferred care played out in the cradle of civilization itself, Mesopotamia. The region's incredible agricultural fertility was entirely an artificial creation, a miracle of hydraulic engineering based on a vast and intricate network of canals diverting water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These canals were the arteries of the empire, and like arteries, they were prone to clogging. Silt, carried by the slow-moving water, would steadily accumulate on the canal beds, reducing their capacity and efficiency. The solution was simple but labor-intensive: regular, organized dredging by a massive workforce. When central authority was strong and societal organization was tight, this dredging was a sacred civic duty. But when empires fractured or leadership became corrupt and distracted, this unglamorous, expensive work was postponed. A season of neglect became a decade and then a century. The canals grew shallower, delivering less water to the fields. Crop yields declined, famine stressed the social order, and the once fertile breadbasket that supported mighty cities like Ur and Babylon slowly transformed back into the desert it once was. Their collapse wasn't an attack from the outside. It was a quiet suffocation from within, caused by the simple accumulation of silt that no one had the will to remove. This historical pattern holds a stark and urgent warning for us today. Modern cities are supported by a vast, unseen underworld of infrastructure: aging water pipes laid down a century ago, electrical grids straining under new demands, bridges whose concrete is quietly spalling and steel is rusting from within. We celebrate the ribbon cutting for a new highway or a new treatment plant, but we chronically underfund the mundane, essential work of inspection, cleaning, and repair. We treat infrastructure as a one-time capital expense, a project to be completed, rather than as a living, breathing system that requires perpetual care and investment. This is the dangerous fallacy of deferred maintenance. It saves money in the short term by mortgaging the future, creating a looming crisis that becomes exponentially more expensive and disruptive to fix. The lesson from the ancients is that infrastructure is not a noun, it is a verb. It is not the bridge itself, but the act of maintaining the bridge. It is not the pipe, but the system for inspecting and replacing the pipe. A resilient city plans for this not as an afterthought, but as a core function of governance, with dedicated revenue streams and a culture that values upkeep as much as innovation. It understands that the true cost of a magnificent aqueduct is not just its construction price, but the forever cost of the crew that walks its length, ensuring the water never stops flowing. To ignore this is to repeat the oldest error in the book, building a masterpiece only to walk away and watch it crumble, wondering how something so strong could ever possibly fail. The shimmering allure of trade has always been a powerful magnet for urban growth, drawing wealth, ideas, and people from distant lands to create cosmopolitan hubs of incredible prosperity. For a city positioned on a major trade route, the world literally came to its doorstep, bringing silks, spices, precious metals, and novel inventions. This influx of external wealth could fund magnificent architecture, support a vibrant class of artisans and scholars, and create a standard of living unimaginable in more isolated communities. Yet this very connectedness, this deep entanglement with far-flung networks, created a hidden fragility. A city that lives by the trade route can also die by it, finding its fate determined by events in distant deserts or on foreign seas over which it has absolutely no control. The history of urbanism is filled with the ghosts of such places. Once thriving metropolises that discovered their prosperity was built on a foundation of sand that could shift without warning. Perhaps no historical example illustrates this delicate balance better than the fabled Silk Road. For centuries, this sprawling network of overland trails was the internet of the ancient world, connecting the Han dynasty in China to the Roman Empire in the West. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar grew fabulously wealthy as vital way stations along this route. They were the ancient equivalent of logistical hubs and data centers, where caravans were resupplied, goods were traded, and cultures intermingled. Their bustling bazaars were filled with a cacophony of languages and the sense of exotic goods, but their entire existence was predicated on a specific geographic and political reality, that the long, dangerous land route was the only viable way to move these goods between continents. This monopoly on east-west trade was their lifeblood, and for a long time it seemed unshakable. That all changed in the 15th century with the dawn of the Age of Exploration. As Portuguese, Spanish, and later Dutch navigators perfected deep-water sailing techniques and mapped oceanic routes, they effectively rewired the global economy. Why undertake a perilous, months-long journey across deserts and mountains, paying tolls to every petty kingdom along the way, when a sturdy ship could carry vastly more cargo directly from source to market? The maritime route around Africa's Cape of Good Hope and across the Indian Ocean was faster, cheaper, and more efficient. Almost overnight, the Silk Road became a historical relic. The great caravan cities did not fall to siege or natural disaster. They were simply bypassed. The flow of wealth that had sustained them for generations was diverted to a new set of players, coastal port cities like Lisbon, Malacca, and later Amsterdam. The inland hubs slowly emptied out, their grand caravanserais falling silent, their economic reason for existing erased by a technological shift they could neither influence nor prevent. This pattern of rise and fall with shifting trade routes is the defining story of port cities throughout history. A harbor that is perfectly positioned for one era's trading patterns can become a backwater in the next. The Italian city-state of Venice owed its magnificence to its role as the gateway for goods flowing from the east into medieval Europe. But when Atlantic trade eclipsed Mediterranean commerce, power shifted to ports on Europe's western coast. In more recent history, the port of Liverpool thrived as a hub of the British Empire and the transatlantic trade, only to suffer a steep decline in the 20th century as containerization changed shipping and manufacturing moved overseas. Their fortunes were never entirely their own. They were tied to the relentless currents of global commerce, currents that can change direction with a new treaty, a new technology, or a new discovery. This historical pattern holds a critical mirror to our modern world. We have built a global supply chain of breathtaking complexity and efficiency, a system that can deliver a specific component from a factory in Malaysia to an assembly line in Germany in a matter of days. This network is the engine of our modern economy, providing us with unprecedented access to goods and keeping prices low. But it also creates a web of interdependency that makes our cities profoundly vulnerable. We need only look at recent events to see this vulnerability in action. A pandemic halts production in one region, and auto factories in another continent shut down for lack of computer chips. A massive container ship blocks the Suez Canal, and the ripple effects disrupt delivery schedules worldwide. A drought in a key agricultural region threatens food security in nations thousands of miles away. A modern city is like a node in a vast global nervous system. A pinprick in one part of the web can be felt as a shockwave everywhere else. The crucial lesson for contemporary urban centers is not to reject globalization, but to build resilience within it. The goal must be to strike a conscious balance between the wealth of global connectedness and the security of local self-sufficiency, particularly for essential goods and services. This doesn't mean a city needs to grow all its own food or manufacture all its own goods, but it should have a plan. It means supporting urban agriculture and regional farms to create a buffer against disruptions in global food supply chains. It means incentivizing local production of critical items like medicines and medical supplies. It means investing in diverse energy sources, including local renewables, to avoid being held hostage to energy shocks in distant countries. A resilient city enjoys the benefits of being a part of the global network, but is not utterly dependent on it for its survival. It cultivates a strong local economy that can keep the lights on and people fed even when the long-distance lines of trade are temporarily severed. This nuanced approach to trade, learning from the ghosts of Samarkand and countless other hubs, allows a city to welcome the world without betting its entire future on the world's unpredictable whims. Imagine the immense frustration of a medieval architect staring at the crumbling ruins of a Roman aqueduct, knowing that his own civilization lacked the technical skill to replicate it. The Romans had perfected a formula for concrete that could set underwater and endure for millennia, yet that precise mixture of volcanic ash, lime, and seawater was a secret lost to time for over 1,000 years. This is the great tragedy of collapsed civilizations. It is not merely the loss of cities, but the loss of the very knowledge that built them. When a society fragments, its libraries burn, its master craftsmen die without apprentices, and its hard-won understanding of the world, from medicine to metallurgy to astronomy, can evaporate in a frighteningly short period, forcing future generations to start from scratch to solve problems that had already been mastered. This pattern of catastrophic knowledge loss is etched into the archaeological record. The Maya developed a complex written language and an astronomical system so precise they could predict planetary movements across vast stretches of time. Yet after their cities were abandoned, the ability to read their stelae and codices vanished entirely. For centuries, their towering temples were seen as the work of a mysterious, lost race, their intellectual achievements completely obscured. It took decades of painstaking work by modern scholars to even begin to decipher their writing and reconstruct their celestial calculations, a process of rediscovering knowledge that had been commonplace among Maya scribes. Similarly, the sophisticated water management techniques of the Nabateans at Petra, or the surgical procedures described in ancient Greek texts, all faded into obscurity, creating periods of technological regression where societies became more vulnerable to the very challenges their ancestors had overcome. This historical vulnerability points to a crucial and often overlooked pillar of urban resilience, a city's commitment to preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations, especially the specialized technical know-how that keeps complex systems running. It's not enough to have brilliant engineers. A society needs a robust system to ensure that the knowledge of how to maintain the aqueduct, operate the power grid, or purify the water supply is never held by just a few aging experts. Concentrated knowledge is incredibly fragile. If the handful of people who understand a city's core infrastructure are lost in a crisis, the entire system can fail from a lack of understanding, not a lack of resources. The cities that have historically weathered disasters most effectively are those with diverse and redundant knowledge systems where information is stored in multiple formats and understood by a broad range of people. Throughout history, humanity has invented institutions specifically to fight this entropy of knowledge. The great libraries of the ancient world, like those at Alexandria and Baghdad, were not mere repositories of books. They were attempts to create a collective brain for civilization, safeguarding everything from poetry to plumbing manuals. The medieval guild system, for all its exclusivity, was a powerful mechanism for knowledge transmission, ensuring that the skills of a master mason or glassblower were passed down through rigorous apprenticeships. Later, universities formalized this process, creating centers for both preserving existing knowledge and generating new learning. In our modern world, we've added digital archives, cloud storage, and online education to this ancient arsenal, creating the most comprehensive system for knowledge preservation ever conceived. Yet these systems are only as strong as our commitment to them. Digital data can be corrupted or made unreadable by evolving software. Physical books can be destroyed. Most dangerously, practical skills can be lost through complacency if we assume technology will always handle the details. The true lesson from the lost formulas of Rome and the silent libraries of the Maya is that knowledge preservation must be an active, continuous, and valued civic duty. It means not just storing information, but ensuring that someone, somewhere, always retains the practical ability to understand and use it. A resilient city invests in its libraries, supports its technical schools, honors its master craftspeople, and most importantly, fosters a culture of continuous learning. It recognizes that its most vital resource isn't stored in a bank or a warehouse, but in the collective mind of its citizens, ensuring that even in the darkest of times, the lights of understanding are never completely extinguished. Perhaps the most heartbreaking example of cultural rigidity is found not in a grand city, but in the remote fjords of Greenland. Here, Norse settlers from Iceland established two small communities in the late 10th century, building stone churches, dairy farms, and a society that was a deliberate, proud replica of the world they had left behind. For generations, they clung to their identity as Christian, cattle-herding Europeans, an identity that was intrinsically tied to their way of life. They wore woolen clothing suited for a cooler, damper climate, not the waterproof sealskin parkas of the Inuit. They persisted in raising cattle and sheep, a practice that required storing vast quantities of hay to see the animals through the long winter, a tremendous drain on labor and resources in an environment with an extremely short growing season. All around them, the Thule culture Inuit not only survived but thrived, employing a technology and lifestyle perfectly honed for the Arctic, hunting seals from kayaks, fishing through ice, and building semi-subterranean homes insulated with sod. The Norse were clearly aware of these successful methods. Archaeological evidence shows contact and even trade between the groups, yet to adopt Inuit ways would have meant surrendering the very core of what it meant to be Norse. Their cultural traditions, the very source of their strength and identity in their homeland, became a cage in their new environment, a set of blinders that prevented them from seeing a path to survival. They chose cultural purity over practical adaptation, and their settlements vanished into silence. In stark contrast, history is filled with examples of cities that treated culture not as a fortress to be defended, but as a living, evolving tapestry, enriched by weaving in threads from others. Ancient Athens, for all its pride, was a magpie for useful ideas, adopting and improving upon Phoenician ship designs, Lydian coinage, and Egyptian artistic techniques. This openness to foreign innovation was a key driver of its golden age. Similarly, the city of Constantinople stood for over a millennium as a crossroads of the world precisely because it mastered the art of synthesis. It blended Roman law, Greek language, Christian faith, and Eastern mysticism into a unique and resilient whole. Its architects studied Persian and Arab designs, incorporating dome and arch techniques that made the Hagia Sophia possible. This cultural flexibility wasn't seen as a threat to their identity, but as a tool for strengthening it, allowing them to absorb shocks and integrate new ideas from the countless cultures that passed through their gates. This presents a profound challenge for any society. How do you honor the past without becoming its prisoner? The answer lies in developing a crucial kind of wisdom, the ability to discern between core values and peripheral practices. Core values are the timeless principles of a culture, a commitment to community, a respect for elders, a shared artistic or spiritual sensibility. These are the anchors that provide stability and meaning. Peripheral practices are the specific, often practical, expressions of those values, the way we build our homes, the specific crops we farm, the tools we use. These must be adaptable. A culture can hold fast to its value of providing for its family while changing its practice from dairy farming to seal hunting. It can maintain its value of artistic beauty while adopting new materials and techniques from neighboring peoples. The failure occurs when specific practices become so fused with cultural identity that they are rendered untouchable, even when they are demonstrably failing. For our modern, hyper-connected cities, this historical lesson is more urgent than ever. We are not facing a slow-changing environment like the Greenland Norse. We are living through a whirlwind of technological disruption, rapid climate shifts, and profound social transformation. The tension is palpable. On one hand, there is a powerful desire to preserve historic neighborhoods, traditional industries, and local customs that give a city its unique character and soul. On the other hand, there is the pressing need to adopt sustainable building materials, embrace green energy, redesign transportation networks, and create inclusive policies for increasingly diverse populations. A city that refuses to change its infrastructure to mitigate flooding out of a desire to preserve its historic layout is making the same calculation as the Norse farmer choosing symbolism over survival. The most resilient cities will be those that learn to curate their culture with a discerning eye. they will actively celebrate and preserve the core values, stories, and arts that define them, ensuring that progress does not mean erasure. But they will also foster a spirit of pragmatic experimentation, creating spaces where new ideas can be tested and useful innovations from other places can be eagerly adopted. They will understand that a city's identity isn't a static monument to be maintained, but a dynamic story that is constantly being written. The goal is not to abandon tradition, but to build a culture that is confident enough in its own core to never stop learning, ensuring that its most cherished customs are not the reasons cited for its collapse, but the very things that helped it adapt and endure. For any city, ancient or modern, the most fundamental equation is also the most perilous to ignore: the delicate balance between the number of people within its walls and the capacity of the land that surrounds it to sustain them. This concept, known as carrying capacity, represents the maximum population size that an environment can support indefinitely without undergoing degradation. History is littered with the remains of cities that solved this equation incorrectly, growing so large and so dense that they effectively consumed their own futures. They fell into the trap of believing their ingenuity could forever override the basic arithmetic of nature, a miscalculation with devastating consequences. We see this pattern play out with tragic clarity on the isolated stage of Easter Island. At its peak, scholars estimate the population may have swelled to 15,000 people or more, a remarkable density for such a small and remote volcanic rock in the Pacific. This number wasn't sustainable by accident. It was achieved through a sophisticated and initially successful society that managed its resources with skill. But that very success contained the seeds of disaster. As the cultural drive to construct the iconic Moai statues intensified, the demand for timber and food surged. The population grew, seemingly confident in its own momentum, without recognizing that it was systematically dismantling the island's ecological foundation. The carrying capacity wasn't a fixed number, it was a shrinking one, decreasing with every palm tree felled for statue transport and every patch of soil eroded by deforestation. The population didn't just exceed the carrying capacity, it actively destroyed it, creating a horrific feedback loop where more people led to fewer resources, which in turn could support even fewer people, culminating in a dramatic and tragic collapse. The Romans, masters of engineering and logistics, attempted a different, equally risky solution to the population problem. The city of Rome itself grew to well over 1 million inhabitants, a size that the agricultural land of central Italy could never hope to feed. Their answer was not to limit their growth, but to extend their reach, to externalize their carrying capacity across the entire Mediterranean basin. The grain-producing provinces of North Africa, Sicily, and especially Egypt became the breadbasket for the capital, with a massive fleet of ships functioning as a lifeline across the sea. This was a breathtaking feat of organization, but it created a profound and dangerous vulnerability. The city's survival became entirely dependent on the uninterrupted function of this complex, long-distance supply chain. A drought in Egypt, a rebellion in North Africa, or pirates disrupting the sea lanes could and did trigger immediate famine and panic in the streets of Rome. They had solved the equation of carrying capacity by making it someone else's problem, but in doing so, they had built a metropolis that was powerful yet paradoxically fragile, its stability held hostage by events in distant lands. These historical cases force us to look in the mirror at our own modern urban realities. Today, urbanization is accelerating at an unprecedented pace. Massive metropolitan areas like Mexico City, Cairo, and Jakarta now host populations of 20 million or more, concentrations of humanity that are almost unimaginable in scale. And like ancient Rome, these cities have externalized their carrying capacity on a global level. They are fed by international supply chains that source food from every continent, powered by energy extracted from distant oil fields and coal mines, and hydrated by water pumped from underground aquifers that are being drained faster than they can recharge. This system creates the illusion of abundance, masking the fact that the city's true ecological footprint, the total area of land and water required to support its consumption and absorb its waste, extends far beyond its geographic borders, often encompassing vast swaths of the planet. The critical lesson from the ghosts of Easter Island and Rome is that technology and trade can extend carrying capacity, but they cannot suspend it indefinitely. They are tools, not laws of physics. A city that grows without regard for the sustainable yield of its regional environment is building on a foundation of borrowed time and borrowed resources. The historical record suggests that truly resilient cities must consciously manage their relationship with their hinterlands. This doesn't mean imposing strict population limits, but rather engaging in smart, integrated planning that connects urban growth to regional resource renewal. It means investing in local and regional agriculture to create a buffer against global supply disruptions. It means designing dense urban living that is resource efficient, prioritizing public transit over private cars and green building practices that conserve energy and water. It means protecting the natural watersheds, forests, and agricultural lands that surround the city, recognizing them not as vacant lots waiting for development, but as vital organs in the metropolitan body, essential for providing clean air, fresh water, and food security. The goal is to create a city that lives within a sustainable balance with its region, so its greatness is measured not by how much it can take from afar, but by how well it can thrive right where it is. If a city's economy is its lifeblood, then water is the very medium in which that lifeblood flows. A fundamental element so critical that its presence or absence, its management or neglect, has written the fate of urban centers with more finality than any emperor's decree or any army's conquest. From the very first human settlements along the Tigris and Euphrates, the story of civilization is at its heart a story of hydrology. Great cities didn't just happen to be near water. They were consciously designed around its capture, its distribution, and its defense. This relationship with water represents one of humanity's oldest and most continuous dialogues with the natural world, a dialogue where listening carefully and adapting wisely meant the difference between a 1,000-year reign and a forgotten ruin. Nowhere is this delicate balance between human ingenuity and aqueous necessity more poetically illustrated than in the rose-red city of Petra, carved into the cliffs of the Jordanian desert. The Nabateans who built it were nothing short of hydrological geniuses. In a landscape that receives mere inches of rain each year, often in sudden, violent flash floods, they engineered a masterpiece of water capture. They carved intricate channels directly into the sandstone canyon walls to divert these torrents, constructed massive dams to control their flow, and built over 200 cisterns to store the precious water for the long dry seasons. This system supported a population of thousands and turned a barren crossroads into a magnificent urban trade hub. Petra's grandeur was not just carved from rock, it was carved from a profound understanding of the desert's rare and fleeting gifts of water. Yet this brilliance contained a hidden fragility. The system was a high-maintenance marvel. The channels required constant cleaning to prevent siltation from those very floods, and the cisterns needed regular repair. When political shifts disrupted the trade routes that were Petra's economic engine, the wealth and will to maintain this intricate network faded. The channels clogged, the cisterns cracked, and the city that had mastered the desert was ultimately defeated not by a lack of water, but by a lack of continuous care, a lesson in the perpetual cost of complex infrastructure. A similar story of brilliant engineering ultimately succumbing to entropy unfolded on the other side of the world, at the sprawling temple complex of Angkor Wat in Cambodia. The Khmer Empire's achievement was arguably even more ambitious, transforming a seasonal tropical landscape into a managed, engineered waterscape. They constructed an elaborate grid of massive reservoirs called barrays, along with a complex network of canals and moats that served a triple purpose: ritual significance, agricultural irrigation, and flood control. This hydraulic system was the bedrock of the empire, allowing it to support a vast urban population and produce surplus rice crops. But like all human-made systems, it had a lifespan. The constant flow of water carried silt, which gradually accumulated in the canals and reservoirs, reducing their capacity and efficiency. Maintaining this system required a powerful, centralized authority capable of organizing the enormous labor force needed for perpetual dredging. As the empire's power waned, likely due to a combination of external threats and internal strife, that organizational capacity dissolved. The maintenance lapsed, the canals silted up, and when a period of intense monsoon rains and droughts arrived, the system was too degraded to respond. The very infrastructure designed to control water became a liability, contributing to flooding and crop failure. Angkor's fate is a powerful reminder that even the most advanced water systems are dynamic, living entities that require unwavering commitment across generations. In stark contrast to these tales of decline stand cities that have woven water management into their very identity, treating it not as a problem to be solved but as a defining element to be embraced. Amsterdam and Venice are the classic examples, both built upon millions of wooden pilings driven into soft, watery ground. Their entire existence is a negotiated settlement with the sea and the canals. For centuries, they have employed a sophisticated dance of water control using windmills and later pumps to drain land, constructing intricate canal networks for transportation and defense, and developing a unique urban fabric where buildings are designed to coexist with constant moisture. These cities demonstrate a cultural adaptability to an aqueous environment, proving that urban life can not only survive but flourish in places that seem inherently hostile to construction. However, their historical success now faces its greatest test from a threat their builders never imagined: human-caused climate change and rising sea levels. The very waters that gave them life and wealth now threaten to overwhelm their defenses, forcing them to innovate once again with massive new barrier systems like Venice's Moss project. Their ongoing struggle highlights that the dialogue with water never ends. The terms are constantly being renegotiated. The historical pattern that emerges from these stories is remarkably consistent and deeply instructive. The cities that endured for centuries were those that adopted a vigilant, respectful, and adaptive relationship with their water sources. They carefully monitored the health of their aquifers and rivers. They invested in the mundane but essential work of maintaining their distribution systems, cleaning aqueducts, dredging canals, repairing pipes. Most importantly, they understood the necessity of conservation during times of abundance, storing water against future scarcity. They viewed water not as an infinite resource to be exploited, but as a precious and sometimes fickle partner in the urban project. Conversely, the cities that failed were often those that grew complacent, assuming their engineering had permanently solved the water equation, only to discover that nature always has the final say. For modern cities, these ancient lessons carry an urgent and profound weight. Today's urban centers face a triple threat of water scarcity: the depletion of ancient aquifers that are being mined much faster than they can recharge, the widespread pollution of freshwater sources by industrial and agricultural waste, and the increasingly erratic water cycles driven by climate change, which bring both punishing droughts and catastrophic floods. The solutions will require a blend of cutting-edge technology and a return to ancient wisdom. This means investing in smart grids that can detect leaks in real time, building desalination plants where appropriate, and most crucially, moving toward a circular water economy where wastewater is treated not as a disposal problem but as a resource to be purified and reused. It also means reviving the ancient practice of rainwater harvesting on a massive scale, creating permeable cities that allow rainfall to replenish aquifers instead of simply running off into overloaded sewers. The goal is to create water-resilient cities that are prepared for both the droughts and the deluges that our changing climate will bring, ensuring that the foundation of urban life remains secure for generations to come. A city's true foundation isn't laid in concrete or stone. It is sown in the soil of the farms that surround it and stored in the granaries that preserve its harvests. This relationship between the urban consumer and the rural producer is the oldest and most vital contract in human civilization, a pact that, when broken, has led to some of history's most dramatic collapses. We build soaring skylines and bustling marketplaces, but these monuments to human achievement are utterly dependent on the often invisible agricultural systems that operate beyond the city walls. A metropolis can survive the loss of a trade route or the fall of a government, but a sustained failure in its food supply is a crisis from which there is no recovery. The story of urbanism is, in many ways, a story of how we feed ourselves, and the historical record is filled with stark warnings about what happens when we forget this most basic truth. The ancient Maya, for all their astronomical and architectural genius, may have ultimately been undone by the very farms that allowed their cities to flourish. To feed a growing population of urban dwellers, priests, and artisans, Maya farmers engaged in intensive agriculture, clearing vast tracts of jungle to create fields. They likely used a technique known as slash and burn, where forest is cut, burned, and planted for a few seasons before the soil is exhausted and new land must be cleared. This practice works well for a scattered, low-density population, but for a large, concentrated urban center, it becomes a recipe for ecological disaster. Over generations, the cycle of clearing, farming, and abandoning would have pushed further and further from the city centers, requiring longer journeys for farmers and creating a sprawling zone of degraded land. More critically, the deforestation led to catastrophic soil erosion. Without tree roots to anchor it, the rich topsoil was washed away by tropical rains, silting up the very reservoirs that were crucial for drinking water and irrigation. The Maya agricultural system was essentially mining the soil, extracting its fertility without replenishing it, until the land could no longer support the grand cities it had helped to build. The Romans, masters of engineering and logistics, approached the problem of urban food supply from a completely different angle, but one that created its own unique vulnerabilities. In the later years of the Republic and into the Empire, agricultural land in Italy was increasingly consolidated into massive estates called latifundia. These were not small family farms growing a diversity of crops for local markets. They were vast, slave-operated plantations specializing in cash crops like grapes for wine and olives for oil, often for export. The grain to feed the massive population of the city of Rome itself, which numbered over 1 million people at its peak, was increasingly imported from conquered provinces like Egypt, Sicily, and North Africa. This system created a dangerous disconnect. The city of Rome became a parasite on its own empire, utterly dependent on the uninterrupted flow of grain ships across the Mediterranean. A bad harvest in Egypt, a rebellion in North Africa, or pirates disrupting the sea lanes could trigger immediate famine and social unrest in the capital. The local agricultural capacity of Italy itself had been allowed to atrophy in favor of a lucrative export model, leaving the heart of the empire terrifyingly vulnerable to shocks in its distant supply lines. In brilliant contrast to these examples of fragility, ancient China offers a powerful model of proactive food security that allowed its great capital cities to weather inevitable periods of scarcity. Chinese administrators developed a sophisticated state-led system of grain storage known as the ever-normal granary. The principle was elegant in its simplicity. In years of abundant harvest, the government would purchase surplus grain from farmers at a fair price. This grain was then stored in a network of granaries strategically located across the empire. Then, during lean years or in times of regional famine or price inflation, the government would release this stored grain onto the market. This served three crucial purposes. It stabilized prices for urban consumers, preventing panic and famine. It provided a reliable market for farmers, encouraging agricultural production. And it created a massive emergency reserve that could be deployed to disaster areas. This system wasn't a temporary fix. It was a deeply embedded institution that recognized food security as a fundamental pillar of state stability and urban resilience. These ancient case studies converge on a set of urgent lessons for the modern city. The first is the critical importance of maintaining local and regional agricultural capacity. A city that paves over its surrounding farmland for suburbs and strip malls is sacrificing its most fundamental form of security. Protecting productive farmland and supporting local farmers isn't just a quaint aesthetic choice. It is a vital investment in resilience, creating a buffer zone that can feed the population when long-distance supply chains are disrupted. The second lesson is the danger of over-specialization and excessive dependence. Just as Rome became hooked on Egyptian grain, many modern cities are now dependent on a handful of global regions for staple foods. A climate disaster or political instability in one of these breadbasket regions could send shockwaves through the global food system, leaving entire cities vulnerable. Finally, the Chinese model reminds us of the power of strategic storage and intelligent distribution. Resilience isn't just about how much food we can produce today. It's about how well we can preserve and manage it for tomorrow. Modern cities can leverage technology to create smarter, more efficient food storage and distribution networks, reducing waste and ensuring that surplus from one season can become a lifeline in the next. As climate change introduces greater volatility into global weather patterns, making droughts, floods, and unseasonable frosts more common, these ancient strategies of diversification, local production, and strategic storage become more relevant than ever. The goal is not full self-sufficiency, but rather what experts call food sovereignty, a city's ability to have a significant degree of control over its own food supply, ensuring that its most basic necessity doesn't depend on the flawless operation of a fragile and distant system. Throughout history, the skyline of a thriving city was often defined by two contrasting features: the elegant spire of a temple reaching for the heavens, and the formidable, unyielding stone of a defensive wall anchoring it to the earth. This physical duality reflected a deeper, constant tension between a society's aspirations for prosperity and its imperative for survival. A city was a repository of wealth, knowledge, and culture, a prize that demanded protection. The strategies employed to provide that security, from sheer physical barriers to intricate webs of diplomacy, were not just military decisions. They were fundamental urban planning choices that could either ensure a millennium of continuity or accelerate a civilization's unraveling. The most iconic symbol of urban defense is, without question, the wall, and few walls in history were as effective as the legendary land walls of Constantinople. Constructed in the 5th century, this was not a simple barrier. It was a masterpiece of military engineering. Imagine facing a multi-layered defense system, a wide moat that could be flooded, an outer low wall for enemy troops to get trapped against, and then the massive inner wall, 40 feet high and 16 feet thick, studded with nearly 100 towers capable of raining down projectiles. For over 800 years, these walls repelled every army that besieged them, from Persians and Arabs to Bulgars and Russians. They allowed the Byzantine Empire to survive as a bastion of civilization while the former Roman West fragmented. The walls did more than just block invaders. They created a psychological aura of invincibility, a secure space where trade, art, and scholarship could flourish for centuries, safe in the knowledge that the gates would hold. In stark contrast, many magnificent cities throughout history placed their faith in something far less tangible than stone: diplomacy and economic influence. These were the open cities, the great trading hubs whose wealth was built on the free flow of goods and ideas. They often maintained only minimal fortifications, believing that their value as commercial partners was a stronger shield than any wall. The Indus Valley civilization, with its meticulously planned cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, shows little evidence of major defensive structures or centralized arsenals. Their security seems to have been rooted in their widespread cultural and trade connections, and perhaps a stable regional order that made large-scale conflict rare. Similarly, during the height of the Pax Romana, many cities within the empire's secure borders allowed their walls to crumble, seeing them as unnecessary relics of a more dangerous past. This strategy worked brilliantly until it didn't. When that overarching imperial security eventually fractured, these open, undefended cities were among the first and easiest to fall to invaders, their commercial wealth making them irresistible targets. This reveals one of the great paradoxes of urban defense. The very act of protecting a city can, if taken to an extreme, become the cause of its decline. A society can become so obsessed with hardening its shell that it neglects the vital systems within. Some scholars suggest this may have been a factor in the struggles of certain classic Maya city-states. In a landscape of constant internecine warfare, rival kingdoms engaged in a frantic arms race, investing tremendous resources into building ever more impressive fortifications and fielding armies. The labor and materials poured into these projects diverted critical energy and resources away from essential civic duties, maintaining agricultural terraces, dredging reservoirs, and managing forests. This militarization, while perhaps necessary in the short term for survival, may have ultimately weakened their resilience to the longer-term environmental threats of drought and soil exhaustion. They successfully defended themselves against the human enemy at the gates, only to be made more vulnerable to the silent, creeping enemy of ecological collapse. The timeless lesson etched into these ancient stones is that security is not a standalone goal. It is a question of balance. A city must find the equilibrium point where it is adequately protected from external threats without becoming a militarized fortress that starves its own economy and social fabric. Total paranoid fortification is as risky as naive openness. The most resilient cities were those that integrated their defensive planning with their economic and social planning. Constantinople's walls were brilliant because they protected a city that was also a thriving economic and cultural center. The defense enabled the prosperity rather than draining it. This principle of balanced, integrated security is more relevant than ever for the modern metropolis, though the nature of the threats has dramatically evolved. The walls we must build today are not made of stone. They are digital firewalls against cyber attacks that could cripple our power grids and financial systems. They are intelligence networks designed to prevent terrorism in crowded public spaces. They are climate-resilient infrastructure to protect against extreme weather events and the social pressures of climate migration. The challenge is no longer just our army at the gates. It is a hacker in a distant country, a violent extremist, or a rising sea level. The core historical insight remains unchanged. A city cannot silo its security planning. It must be woven into the fabric of everything, from the design of public spaces that allow for both open enjoyment and secure monitoring, to the architecture of our digital networks that power everything from traffic lights to hospitals. True urban security in the 21st century means understanding that a power outage is a security crisis, that a breached data server is a threat to public safety, and that a failed harvest due to climate change hundreds of miles away can lead to migration that tests a city's social cohesion. The goal is not to retreat behind physical or digital moats, but to build a city that is robust, adaptable, and deeply interconnected in its defenses, ensuring that its vitality is protected from every conceivable angle. Disaster has always been an unwelcome but constant visitor to human settlements, a test that separates the resilient from the fragile. The ruins of ancient cities hold within them not just the stories of their daily lives, but also the dramatic tales of how they faced moments of ultimate crisis. Their responses to catastrophe, whether fire, earthquake, plague, or invasion, offer a stark ledger of what works and what fails when the world seems to be falling apart. This historical record reveals that survival is rarely a matter of luck. It is a product of foresight, planning, and the social cohesion that allows a community to act as one in the face of unimaginable pressure. Consider the remarkable resilience of ancient Rome, a city that seemed to be a magnet for disaster yet repeatedly demonstrated an incredible capacity for renewal. In 64 CE, a catastrophic fire swept through the city's narrow, wooden-packed streets, burning for 6 days and 7 nights and reducing vast swaths of the city to smoldering ash. A lesser city might have been broken by such a blow, but Rome's response was swift and decisive. Emperor Nero, whatever his later reputation, initiated a massive reconstruction effort. He implemented new building codes that mandated the use of more fire-resistant materials like stone and concrete, and required wider streets to act as fire breaks. He also oversaw the construction of grander public spaces and a more organized city plan. This was not just rebuilding, it was improving, using the disaster as a catalyst to create a safer, more beautiful, and more functional city. Rome's story teaches us that a true recovery doesn't just restore what was lost, it learns from the catastrophe and builds back smarter. For a tragic counterexample, we need only look to the fate of Pompeii and Herculaneum, frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. Here was a disaster so sudden and so overwhelming that it bypassed any capacity for response. There were no emergency protocols for a volcanic eruption, no practiced evacuation routes. The cities were simply entombed, their citizens preserved in their final moments of terror. The lesson of Pompeii is not about failure, but about the absolute necessity of anticipating the unique threats of one's environment. The inhabitants knew Vesuvius was a mountain, but they did not understand it was a volcano poised to explode. Their tragedy underscores a critical principle of disaster preparedness. The most dangerous threat is often the one you haven't imagined or have forgotten how to see. A city must study its own geography and history to understand the full spectrum of potential disasters it could face. This contrast between prepared and unprepared becomes even starker when we examine the Great Plague that swept across continents. The Black Death of the 14th century absolutely devastated the crowded, unsanitary cities of medieval Europe. With narrow, waste-filled streets and no concept of public health infrastructure, these urban centers were perfect incubators for disease. There were no organized responses beyond panic and prayer. Officials fled, bodies piled up in the streets, and society fractured under the strain. The death toll was catastrophic, not just in lives lost, but in the profound social and economic trauma that followed. Yet, during this same period, some port cities in the Mediterranean and others in the Islamic world, with their advanced medical knowledge and stronger central administrations, fared somewhat better. They implemented early forms of quarantine, isolating incoming ships and the sick, understanding even dimly that separation could slow the spread. This divergence in outcomes highlights that knowledge and organization are themselves a form of infrastructure, a societal immune system that can mean the difference between a terrible blow and a civilization-ending event. The common thread running through these historical responses is the undeniable value of what we now call redundancy and distributed resources. The cities that recovered best were those that were not overly centralized. They had multiple sources of fresh water, not just one aqueduct. They had food stored in granaries scattered throughout the city, not in a single central warehouse. They had secondary systems and fallback plans. When fire destroyed one market district, commerce could continue in another. When plague quarantined one neighborhood, others could still function. This principle of decentralization creates buffers against shock, ensuring that a failure in one part of the system doesn't lead to a total, cascading collapse. It is the embodiment of the old adage, "Don't put all your eggs in one basket." For our modern cities, facing down a new era of climate-enhanced disasters and global pandemics, these ancient lessons are not academic, they are a survival manual. We have technology the Romans could never dream of: satellite early warning systems, sophisticated disease modeling, and instant global communication. But the core principles remain unchanged. We must invest in redundant critical infrastructure so a power grid failure doesn't cripple our water pumps and hospitals simultaneously. We need to maintain distributed stockpiles of essential supplies, from medical equipment to emergency generators. Most importantly, we must practice. Ancient cities that faced frequent threats like seasonal floods or raids developed ingrained cultural responses. Our modern drills for earthquakes, fires, and active shooters serve the same purpose: to move the response from a panicked, conscious thought to a rehearsed, muscle memory action. The goal is to weave resilience into the very fabric of the city, creating a community that is not surprised by disaster, but is prepared to meet it, absorb its impact, and begin the work of recovery without missing a beat. Human history is filled with brilliant flashes of technological genius that transformed urban life, yet this very ingenuity often contains a hidden double edge. A revolutionary innovation can solve one pressing problem while quietly sowing the seeds for a future crisis, creating systems of such intricate complexity that they become fragile, or enabling resource consumption on a scale that eventually overwhelms the environment. The relationship between technology and urban resilience is not a simple story of progress. It is a nuanced dance of trade-offs where every leap forward demands we ask a critical question. Does this new tool truly make our city stronger, or does it merely weave a more elaborate web of potential failure? Consider the Romans, master engineers who brought comfort to their citizens through the hypocaust, an ingenious system of underfloor heating that circulated hot air from furnaces through spaces beneath the floors and behind the walls of villas and public baths. This was a marvel of comfort and public health, a testament to their engineering prowess. Yet to keep these furnaces burning constantly during cold months required a staggering amount of wood. While direct evidence is complex to trace, Some historians suggest that the voracious appetite of hypocaust systems, combined with the fuel needs for metalworking, pottery kilns, and heating countless other homes, placed immense pressure on the forests surrounding Rome and other major cities. This potentially contributed to regional deforestation, which in turn could lead to soil erosion and the silting up of rivers. Their technological solution to the problem of cold may have inadvertently exacerbated problems of resource scarcity and environmental degradation, a classic case of solving one challenge while creating another, perhaps greater one. This pattern stands in stark contrast to the elegant solutions developed by architects in the ancient Arabic world, who mastered the art of passive cooling. Faced with a harsh desert climate, they didn't fight the environment with complex, energy-hungry machines. They collaborated with it through intelligent design. They built wind catchers or badgers, magnificent towers that captured even the faintest breezes and funneled them down into building interiors, creating a natural and effortless ventilation system. They designed courtyards with pools and fountains, using the cooling effect of evaporating water to lower ambient temperatures. Their buildings featured massively thick walls that absorbed heat during the day and slowly released it at night, and they used light-colored materials to reflect the intense sun. This was technology in its most resilient form. It required no external fuel source, it had no moving parts to break down, and it was perfectly adapted to its local context. It enhanced sustainability without introducing new vulnerabilities, proving that sometimes the most advanced solution is the one that works in harmony with nature, not against it. The critical lesson that emerges from comparing the Roman hypocaust with the Arabic windcatcher is not that technology is inherently good or bad, but that its value is measured by its alignment with the goal of resilience. Technology should be a tool that simplifies survival and reduces dependency, not one that adds layers of complexity and new points of potential failure. The simplest solutions, often born from deep observation of the local environment, frequently prove to be the most durable because they are understandable, repairable, and adaptable by the communities that use them. They don't create a class of specialized technicians without whom the entire system grinds to a halt. In a crisis, when supply chains break and specialized parts are unavailable, a wind catcher will still catch the wind, while a complex heating system will fall silent. For modern city planners and citizens, this historical lens forces us to reevaluate our own technological choices with a more critical eye. We are surrounded by promises of smart cities, where sensors monitor everything from traffic flow to garbage bin levels, and where algorithms are supposed to optimize every aspect of urban life. But does this vast, interconnected web of data and devices genuinely enhance our long-term resilience, or does it create a system of terrifying fragility? A city reliant on a centralized smart grid is incredibly efficient until a cyber attack takes it down. Autonomous vehicles may promise smoother traffic, but they also introduce new dependencies on constant software updates, precise mapping, and vulnerable communication networks. The question we must ask is whether we are building systems that are robust and redundant, or ones that are merely efficient until the moment they catastrophically fail. The goal should not be complexity for its own sake, but appropriate technology that empowers communities, conserves resources, and can be maintained with local knowledge and materials. True urban innovation isn't about having the most gadgets. It's about creating a city that can keep its people safe, comfortable, and connected through both good times and bad, using tools that strengthen rather than weaken its inherent capacity to endure. Think of a great city not as a static collection of buildings, but as a living, breathing creature. It must eat, it must drink, it must expend energy to move and grow, and it must inevitably produce waste. This concept, known as urban metabolism, gives us a powerful lens through which to view the health and longevity of any metropolis, ancient or modern. Every single day, a city consumes vast quantities of resources: water, food, timber, stone, and energy, and in return, it expels equally vast quantities of waste, sewage, garbage, and pollution. The fundamental question of urban survival has always been how to manage this constant flow without poisoning itself or exhausting the land that feeds it. History shows us that when this metabolic balance is lost, when the consumption far outpaces the environment's ability to regenerate, collapse is not a matter of if, but when. We can see this metabolic failure clearly in the archaeological record of countless ancient cities. To build their magnificent structures, they engaged in rampant deforestation, stripping the surrounding hillsides of trees for timber and fuel. The Mayan city of Tikal, for instance, would have required enormous amounts of wood to produce the lime plaster for its temples, a process that involved burning limestone in giant kilns. This deforestation didn't just deplete a building resource, it set off a catastrophic chain reaction. Without tree roots to anchor the soil, the thin tropical earth washed away with every rain, silting up the vital reservoirs and agricultural terraces that the society depended upon for survival. Their urban metabolism became parasitic, consuming the very foundation of its own existence. Similarly, many Mesopotamian cities saw their agricultural fields, the source of their wealth, slowly turn barren and saline from centuries of irrigation without proper drainage. They were literally mining the fertility from their soil, extracting nutrients without putting anything back, until the land could no longer support the urban population it had once nurtured. This ancient pattern reveals the fatal flaw of a linear economy, a system of take, make, and dispose that has dominated human settlement for millennia. In a linear model, resources are extracted from nature, transformed into goods, used, and then discarded as waste, with the assumption that there will always be more to take. This might work for a small village, but for a dense urban center, it is a suicide pact. The waste has to go somewhere, and it invariably ends up polluting the local water and air, while the demand for new resources pushes further and further into the wilderness, creating a sprawling footprint of ecological degradation. The city becomes a black hole, sucking in resources from an ever-widening area and spewing out waste, until the costs of this linear system, both environmental and economic, become too great to bear. The alternative, and the crucial lesson for our time, is to shift from a linear metabolism to a circular one. Imagine a city that functions more like a forest ecosystem, where there is no such thing as waste. In a forest, a fallen tree is not garbage. It becomes a nursery for new life, a home for insects, and eventually, nutrients that feed the next generation of trees. A circular urban economy seeks to mimic this beautiful efficiency. It means designing buildings that can be easily disassembled and their materials reused rather than demolished and sent to a landfill. It means treating wastewater not as a problem to be disposed of, but as a valuable resource from which we can recover nutrients for agriculture and even generate energy. Food scraps become compost to enrich urban farms, and industrial byproducts from one process become the raw materials for another. This isn't just a theoretical ideal, it's a practical pathway to resilience that several modern cities are already exploring. Amsterdam, for example, has embraced the donut economics model, which explicitly frames the city's goal as operating within the ecological ceiling of the planet while ensuring a social foundation for all its citizens. This involves ambitious plans to become a fully circular city by 2050, with initiatives ranging from constructing buildings from reusable materials to creating systems where products are leased rather than sold, ensuring manufacturers retain responsibility for their goods at the end of their life. On a smaller scale, the concept of urban mining is gaining traction, the idea of seeing our cities themselves as vast urban quarries. The staggering amount of metals, minerals, and glass already embedded in our buildings and infrastructure represents a huge reservoir of resources that we can tap into, drastically reducing the need for environmentally destructive mining elsewhere. Ultimately, the metabolic perspective forces us to see the city as a single, integrated system. It connects the dots between the water from our tap, the food on our plate, the energy powering our homes, and the waste in our bins. It shows us that a decision about transportation policy affects air quality, that a choice about building materials affects the health of distant forests, and that how we manage our wastewater directly impacts the aquatic life in our rivers and oceans. By learning from the collapsed cities of the past, we can begin to redesign our own urban metabolisms, closing the loops and creating systems where nothing is wasted and everything is valued. This shift from a linear extractive process to a circular regenerative one is perhaps the most important transformation we can undertake to ensure our cities don't just survive, but thrive for centuries to come. When we step back from the individual stories of the Maya, the Romans, and the others, a startling and sobering convergence emerges from the dust. These civilizations were separated by vast oceans and millennia, yet their downfalls were orchestrated by the same 5 relentless horsemen of collapse. First, and perhaps most fundamentally, is the pattern of ecological overshoot, where a society's appetite for resources consistently outpaces the environment's ability to regenerate them. We see it on Easter Island with the last palm tree falling, and in the Maya lowlands with the exhausted soils washing away. It's the story of a civilization living not on the interest of its natural capital, but by consuming the capital itself until the account is empty. This environmental pressure invariably tightens the screws on the second pattern, social fragmentation. As resources become scarce, the shared sense of community that binds a city together often fractures along the lines of inequality. The ruling elites of the Maya, isolated in their ceremonial centers, lost the trust of the people when their rituals failed to bring rain. In the late Roman Empire, the wealthy patrician class retreated to their fortified villas, hoarding resources and abandoning any sense of civic duty to the common citizen. This erosion of social cohesion is catastrophic because it destroys a society's most vital weapon during a crisis: its ability to act collectively, to share burdens, and to forge a unified response to shared threats. The third recurring pattern is economic overspecialization, the dangerous gamble of placing all your eggs in one basket. Venice became unimaginably wealthy by mastering Mediterranean trade, but when new oceanic routes made that mastery irrelevant, the city's entire economic reason for being evaporated. The Roman economy became a brittle, monolithic giant dependent on grain shipments from a single province. This lack of diversification creates a terrifying vulnerability. When the one industry or trade route fails, the entire urban system seizes up for lack of alternatives. There is no backup plan, no secondary engine to keep the city alive while it adapts. Compounding these issues is the fourth pattern: institutional rigidity. This is the failure of a society's governing structures to learn, adapt, and respond to new information. The Greenland Norse were trapped by their cultural identity as European pastoralists, unable to adopt the superior Arctic survival techniques of the Inuit people living alongside them. The Khmer Empire at anchor had a brilliantly centralized system for managing water, but that same top-down structure proved too slow and inflexible to adapt when the climate changed and their intricate network began to fail. Their institutions were designed for stability in a static world, not for agility in a dynamic one. Finally, underpinning it all is the silent killer of infrastructure decay. The magnificent Roman aqueducts didn't explode in a day. They fell silent over generations through 1,000 small neglects, a death by 1,000 cuts. The maintenance crews were disbanded, the cracks went unrepaired, and the lifeblood of the city gradually slowed to a trickle. This deferred maintenance is a form of societal short-sightedness, a quiet mortgaging of the future that always comes due with catastrophic interest. What makes these 5 patterns so profoundly dangerous is not that they operate in isolation, but that they feed into each other in a vicious, synergistic spiral. An environmental drought leads to crop failure. Crop failure causes economic hardship and rising food prices. This economic stress fuels social unrest and erodes trust in governing institutions. A weakened, distrusted government then lacks the authority or resources to organize a response to the next crisis, whether it's maintaining the aqueducts or mounting a defense. A society that might have weathered any one of these storms in isolation finds itself completely overwhelmed when they all converge at once. The stories of these vanished cities tell us that resilience cannot be built in a single dimension. A city cannot just be environmentally sustainable if it is socially fractured, or economically diversified if its institutions are brittle. True endurance requires a holistic approach, a conscious effort to strengthen all of these systems simultaneously, understanding that the strength of the whole depends entirely on the integrity of each interconnected part. So how do we translate these ancient warnings into a modern blueprint for action? The lessons from history are not meant to be merely admired behind glass. They are a practical toolkit for urban planners, policymakers, and engaged citizens to build the shock-absorbent cities of tomorrow. This isn't about abandoning our technological advances, but rather about weaving timeless principles of resilience into the very fabric of our 21st century metropolises, creating urban centers that are not just smarter, but wiser. One of the most immediate applications lies in rethinking our relationship with food. The Roman over-reliance on Egyptian grain is a perfect parallel to our modern dependence on sprawling global supply chains, where a city's supermarkets might be only 3 days away from empty shelves if those intricate networks are disrupted. The antidote is a renewed focus on local and regional food systems. This goes beyond trendy farmers' markets. It means implementing policies that protect precious farmland from urban sprawl, creating financial incentives for new farmers, and integrating food production into the city itself through vertical farms in repurposed warehouses and widespread community garden programs. A city that can produce even 20% of its fresh vegetables locally has built a crucial buffer against the kind of external shocks that toppled ancient empires, turning consumers into active participants in their own food security. Water, the lifeblood of every great city, demands a similar shift from linear consumption to circular reuse. Instead of the old model of pumping water from a distant source, using it once, and then expelling it as waste, the most forward-thinking cities are aiming for water independence at the neighborhood level. Imagine districts designed as self-contained watersheds, where green roofs and permeable pavements capture rainwater, where grey water from showers and sinks is treated and reused for irrigation and toilet flushing, and where beautiful, constructed wetlands naturally purify runoff before it returns to the environment. This mimics the ancient Maya's sophisticated capture systems, but enhances them with modern filtration and monitoring technology, creating a resilient, multi-loop water system that is far less vulnerable to drought or contamination of a single central source. The very stuff our cities are made of also needs a radical rethink. The ancient Romans built with stone and concrete that could be repaired, but we have often built with materials and methods that demand total replacement. The new paradigm is modular and regenerative design. Think of buildings constructed with prefabricated components that can be easily disassembled, with walls that can be opened up to replace wiring and pipes without tearing down drywall, and with materials that are selected for their ability to be reused or composted at the end of their life. This approach moves us away from the destructive cycle of demolition and landfill, and towards a model where the city itself becomes a bank of valuable materials for future projects, dramatically reducing both waste and the constant demand for virgin resources. Perhaps the most profound application of ancient wisdom is in the social realm. The fate of the Maya and Romans teaches us that gleaming infrastructure is useless without the social cohesion to maintain it and the collective will to adapt. Modern cities can actively engineer this cohesion by investing in inclusive, high-quality public spaces, not just decorative plazas, but vibrant parks, pedestrianized streets, and community centers that are designed to bring diverse people together in shared experiences. These are the spaces where trust is built, where neighbors become more than strangers, and where the social capital that is so critical in a crisis is forged. It's the difference between a collection of individuals living in proximity and a genuine community that can self-organize and support one another when facing challenges. Ultimately, the greatest barrier to implementing these strategies is not technological or even financial. It is the tyranny of short-term thinking. The political cycle of 4 or 5 years incentivizes ribbon-cutting on new projects but discourages the patient, long-term investment in maintenance and resilience that may not yield visible results for a decade or more. Overcoming this requires a fundamental shift in how we measure success, moving beyond quarterly economic reports and instead valuing metrics like groundwater levels, social connectivity indices, and the diversity of the local economic base. It demands that we empower city planners with a mandate that spans generations, not just election cycles, and that we as citizens champion leaders who are willing to plant trees whose shade they may never sit under. The echoes of collapse urge us to lift our gaze from the immediate horizon and make choices today that will allow our urban centers to thrive for centuries to come, becoming not just monuments to our ambition, but legacies of our foresight. These silent stones and empty plazas are not just relics, they are messengers, and their message is growing more urgent with every passing year. The challenges we face today, climate change, resource depletion, mass migration, social inequality, are not entirely new. They are simply appearing on a larger, more interconnected scale. The Maya's localized drought is now our global climate crisis. Rome's fragile grain supply lines are now our hyper-efficient but brittle global supply chains. Easter Island's isolated ecological overshoot is now a planetary condition. The fundamental patterns are the same, which means the wisdom needed to navigate them is also the same, waiting for us in the archaeological record. The central lesson echoing across the centuries is that resilience is not a technological puzzle to be solved, but a delicate balance to be perpetually maintained. It is the balance between our ambition for growth and our respect for ecological limits. A city that pursues expansion without regard for the water it drinks, the air it breathes, and the soil that feeds it is following the same path as the Maya, just with more sophisticated tools. It is the balance between the efficiency of centralization and the resilience of decentralization. While a centralized power grid or a single-source food supply might be cheaper to operate, it creates a single point of catastrophic failure, just as Rome discovered when its grain fleets were interrupted. The most durable systems are often distributed and redundant, with local food production, decentralized energy sources, and neighborhood-level preparedness creating a web of support that can't be severed by one disaster. Perhaps the most profound balance is between the comfort of tradition and the necessity of innovation. The Greenland Norse perished because they clung to a cultural identity that was ill-suited to their new environment, refusing to adopt the effective practices of their Inuit neighbors. Their story is a powerful warning against allowing our sense of who we are to prevent us from becoming who we need to be to survive. A resilient city honors its past without being imprisoned by it. It preserves the core values of community, beauty, and heritage while being ruthlessly pragmatic about updating its practices, its infrastructure, and its economy to meet new realities. This requires a culture of humility and continuous learning, a willingness to look at what is working in other places and adapt it, just as ancient cities that thrived were often magpies for the best ideas from across the known world. Ultimately, these echoes of collapse call us to a deeper understanding of what a city truly is. It is not a collection of buildings or a hub of economic transaction. A city is a living organism, an ecosystem of human and natural elements inextricably linked. Its health is measured not only by its gross domestic product but by the health of its soil, the cleanliness of its water, the strength of its community bonds, and the wisdom of its governance. The vanished Metropolises remind us that when we ignore this holistic reality, when we privilege one part of the system at the expense of all others, the entire organism eventually sickens and dies. Let us then honor these lost cities not with a moment of silence but with a lifetime of attentive listening. Let their fates guide our hands as we plan our neighborhoods, shape our policies, and build our communities. Let the Maya teach us to watch our water tables and protect our soils. Let the Romans remind us to maintain our infrastructure and diversify our economies. Let the Norse caution us against the arrogance of tradition, and let the citizens of Easter Island stand as our eternal warning against consuming our future for the monuments of today. The conversation about our urban future is the most important one we can have, and it is a conversation that has been ongoing for thousands of years. We are simply the latest voices to join it. The stones have spoken. The only question that remains is whether we are wise enough to listen. If this journey through the echoes of vanished cities has resonated with you, then you are already one of us, a thinker deeply invested in the future of the places we call home. This conversation is far too critical to end here. It needs to continue to grow and to inspire real action. By subscribing to this channel and hitting that notification bell, you are not just passively watching a video, you are joining a community of urban futurists. You are connecting with planners, policymakers, students, and passionate citizens who believe that by understanding the past, we can build urban centers that are not just larger or smarter, but truly wiser and more enduring. Every video we create is designed to equip you with this long-view perspective, blending forgotten historical patterns with today's most promising innovations to chart a course for the cities of tomorrow. The most powerful ideas are those that are shared. Think of one person in your life who is shaping your community, perhaps a local official, a teacher, an architect, or a curious friend. Share this video with them. By passing along these lessons from history, you become a vital link in a chain of awareness, helping to spread this crucial knowledge to those who are literally designing our future. Your simple act of sharing can plant a seed that influences a policy decision, inspires a student's thesis, or changes the way a neighborhood is planned. This is how we collectively turn the page from simply studying collapse to actively fostering renewal. The comment section below is not just a box for reactions. It is the living heart of our community and the perfect place to continue this essential dialogue. I am genuinely eager to hear your thoughts. Look around at the modern cities of today. Which one do you believe stands as the best example of learning from history's hard lessons? Is there a metropolis that has brilliantly adapted its water management, reinvented its social fabric, or diversified its economy in ways that echo the wisdom we've discussed? Tell us about it. Your observations and insights enrich this conversation for everyone, turning a monologue into a vibrant, global discussion. Together, let's ensure that the whispers from these ancient ruins are not heard as grim prophecies, but are embraced as powerful inspirations for building a world that thrives for centuries